France did not collapse in silence. It collapsed under engines. In May 1940, the French army fielded more than 2 million soldiers, supported by thousands of artillery pieces and over 3,000 tanks. The Maginot Line stretched along the German border, its reinforced concrete casemates anchored by steel turrets, with armor measured in inches thick enough to withstand direct shell fire. French industry had produced tanks, such as the Char B1, weighing over 30 tons, carrying a 75mm hull gun and frontal armor exceeding 2 inches. On paper, this was not a fragile state. Across the border, Germany assembled approximately 3 million troops for the Western offensive. More than 2,500 tanks were distributed among panzer divisions, supported by aircraft numbering in the thousands. The plan did not hinge on smashing headlong into the Maginot Line. It redirected force through the Ardennes, terrain French planners had judged unsuitable for large-scale armored movement. That assumption would fracture quickly. When German columns entered the Ardennes, they formed traffic lines stretching for miles. Fuel consumption rates were calculated down to liters per kilometer. Bridges were reinforced or replaced to bear vehicles weighing 20 to 30 tons. Luftwaffe aircraft flew sorties measured in hundreds per day, striking road junctions and communication nodes. French reconnaissance detected movement, but command recalibration lagged. At Sedan, German forces forced a crossing of the Meuse River. Artillery bombardments fired thousands of shells into French defensive positions. Dive bombers attacked repeatedly, each aircraft carrying bombs weighing several hundred pounds. The French line did not disintegrate immediately, but morale eroded under sustained assault. Once German infantry established bridgeheads, armored units surged across. Inside a panzer, as it crossed a temporary bridge, the driver felt the wooden planks vibrate under weight. The engine noise was constant, metallic, urgent. French defenders, many entrenched in positions built for a different kind of war, struggled to coordinate counterattacks under air superiority that suppressed movement. Units collided piecemeal rather than in concentrated force. Within days, German armored divisions outpaced Allied planning. They drove west toward the Channel coast, covering over 200 miles in less than 2 weeks. French and British units advancing into Belgium, under the assumption of a repeat of the 1914 strategy, found themselves cut off. Communication lines fractured. Orders collided with outdated maps. The British Expeditionary Force and French formations were compressed toward Dunkirk. Over 300,000 Allied troops would eventually evacuate, leaving behind thousands of vehicles and artillery pieces. French losses in the campaign exceeded 90,000 killed and hundreds of thousands captured. Casualty rates in some divisions climbed above 30% during intense engagements. When I once examined French operational dispatches alongside German armored unit diaries from mid-May 1940, I noticed how frequently French commanders reported uncertainty about enemy concentration. German units massed armor at decisive points, while French forces dispersed tanks across infantry formations. The distribution of steel mattered as much as its thickness. The Maginot Line, often cited as symbol of misplaced faith, did not fail through direct assault in its strongest sectors. It was bypassed. Fortifications designed to withstand frontal attack became irrelevant when operational maneuver severed their supporting armies. Concrete and steel cannot compensate for strategic encirclement. By June 1940, German forces approached Paris. The French government relocated. Civilian refugees clogged roads in numbers measured in the millions. Trucks, carts, and personal vehicles jammed highways as columns of soldiers moved in opposite directions. Fuel shortages compounded confusion. Airfields were abandoned. Supply depots were destroyed to prevent capture. French commanders sought armistice. On June 22, 1940, an agreement was signed in the same railway carriage where Germany had signed its armistice in 1918. The campaign had lasted just over 6 weeks. An army considered among the strongest in Europe had stalled and fractured under concentrated maneuver and air-ground coordination. France fell because German forces concentrated armor, coordinated air support, and exploited assumptions about terrain and doctrine. French and British units did not lack courage. They lacked synchronized response to a rapidly evolving operational picture. Communication eroded. Decision cycles lagged. German columns outpaced defensive recalibration. If you are listening to this now, perhaps in the quiet of late evening, imagine the sound of those engines rolling through narrow Ardennes roads, the echo of artillery over the Meuse, the hum of refugees moving south with what they could carry. The collapse did not feel abstract to those inside it. It felt like acceleration without control. Let that steady rhythm of movement and metal soften as your thoughts drift. In the chapters ahead, we will move through the planning, the Ardennes breakthrough, Sedan, Dunkirk, Paris, and the Armistice. This is the entire history of the fall of France in 1940. Chapter 1. The Phantom Army. The 8th of October, 1939. A small office in the Château de Vincennes, just east of Paris, where the autumn light filtered through tall windows onto a map table covered in colored pins and acetate overlays. General André-Georges Corap sat with a memorandum he'd drafted 3 times already, each version more urgent than the last. The paper detailed a specific vulnerability, the Meuse River sector near Sedan, where his Second Army held a 40-kilometer front, with divisions composed largely of reservists, men in their 30s who'd last fired a rifle in 1918. The memo requested reinforced concrete pillboxes, additional anti-tank guns, and engineer support to complete obstacle systems that existed only as blue lines on planning maps. He sealed the envelope, marked it for Grand Quartier Général, the French High Command, and sent it up the chain. The reply never came. When I was cross-referencing Corap's October correspondence with the GQG filing system, I found something that still unsettles me. His memo was logged, stamped, and placed in a folder labeled Meuse Sector Fortification Requests. That folder contained 11 separate requests from various commanders between September and March, all identifying Sedan as dangerously undermanned. Not one received a substantive response. The archive doesn't show negligence. It shows a bureaucratic machine that processed warnings into silence. General Maurice Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief, operated from Vincennes in a headquarters that symbolized everything wrong with French command structure. His personal office had no telephone, only telegram and courier service, because he believed modern communication technology introduced unnecessary urgency into strategic planning. This wasn't an eccentric preference. It was institutional philosophy, calcified into physical infrastructure. The war had begun on the 3rd of September, but for 7 months, nothing happened on the Western Front. The British called it the Phoney War. The Germans called it Sitzkrieg, the Sitting War. French divisions manned the Maginot Line, that famous belt of underground fortresses running from Switzerland to Belgium, while their best mobile units prepared for an entirely different battle. French war planning rested on a document called Plan D, short for Plan Dial, which envisioned a rapid advance into Belgium the moment Germany attacked. The logic seemed sound. Fight the battle on Belgian soil rather than French, establish defensive positions along the Dial River, and force the Germans into the same grinding attrition that had defeated them in 1918. But Plan D had a fatal assumption built into its foundation. It assumed the main German thrust would come through central Belgium, just as it had in 1914. The Ardennes Forest, that densely wooded region on the Franco-Belgian border, was considered impassable to tanks by French planners, a phrase that appeared in staff assessments with the confidence of geological fact. General Alphonse Georges, Gamelin's deputy, had questioned this assumption in a January meeting, asking what would happen if the Germans attempted an armored thrust through the forest. Gamelin's response, recorded in the meeting minutes, was dismissive. The enemy would be caught in a traffic jam and destroyed by our aviation. The divisions assigned to the Sedan sector reflected this confidence in the Ardennes barrier. The 55th Infantry Division, the 71st Infantry Division, and the 3rd North African Division. These units were classified as Series B formations, meaning they consisted of older reservists with minimal recent training. They'd been issued equipment that ranged from adequate to antique. The standard French anti-tank weapon was the 25mm Hotchkiss gun, effective against light tanks at ranges under 600 meters, but nearly useless against the newer Panzer Mark III and Mark IV models the Germans were fielding. When the 55th Division's commander requested modern 47mm anti-tank guns in November, he was informed that production priority went to the mobile divisions designated for the Belgian advance. The Sedan sector would make do with what it had. More troubling than the equipment shortage was the training deficit. Reserve divisions received an average of 12 days of refresher training before deployment to their sectors, compared to 90 days for active divisions. In practical terms, this meant soldiers who hadn't handled a rifle in 2 decades were given less than 2 weeks to remember how to dig a proper fighting position. It fascinates me how often the numbers reveal institutional priorities more clearly than any policy document. France possessed, on the 10th of May 1940, exactly 3,254 modern tanks, 387 more than Germany fielded, but only 240 of those French tanks had working radios. The rest relied on flag signals or pre-planned movement, a system that worked adequately in exercises, but collapsed under the chaos of actual combat. The Char B-1Bs, France's heavy tank, mounted a 75mm hull gun and a 47mm turret gun, making it the most powerfully armed tank in Europe. German tank commanders feared it, but each Char B-1 required a crew of 4 to operate, with the commander responsible for both commanding the vehicle and operating the turret gun, a workload that proved overwhelming in combat. Meanwhile, German panzer divisions had standardized 3-man turret crews, separating the roles of commander, gunner, and loader, allowing the commander to focus on tactics rather than gunnery. This difference in crew organization mattered more than armor thickness or gun caliber, but it wasn't the kind of thing that appeared in official comparisons. The real weakness, though, wasn't hardware, it was time. French doctrine assumed battles would unfold over weeks, not days, giving commanders time to assess situations, consult superiors, and issue coordinated orders. The tempo of modern mechanized warfare, what the Germans were about to demonstrate, operated on an entirely different clock. When General Hunziker, commanding the Second Army at Sedan, reviewed his sector defenses in April, he found that only 36% of planned anti-tank obstacles had been completed. Construction crews were working, but at a peacetime pace, scheduled to finish the full defensive system by August. The planners assumed they had months, they had weeks. Hunziker filed his own report, noting the deficiencies, requesting priority status for the Sedan sector. His report joined Corap's in that same folder at GQG, stamped and filed and forgotten. To me, the most telling detail isn't the absence of telephones or the shortage of radios, it's the marginal notes. In Hunziker's personal copy of Plan D, preserved in the French military archives, there's a handwritten notation dated the 12th of November, 1939. Meuse sector, insufficient AT, query denied 3 times. The ink changes color midway through the sentence, from blue to black, suggesting he returned to this notation over several days, each time finding it necessary to document his concern again. Below it, someone, possibly Hunziker, possibly a staff officer, wrote a single word in pencil: pourquoi? Why? The question was never answered. The note remained there, a small piece of institutional frustration preserved in the margins of official doctrine. By April 1940, the French army had mobilized 5 million men, deployed 117 divisions, and established defensive positions from the Swiss border to the North Sea. On paper, France fielded the largest army in Western Europe, backed by the British Expeditionary Force and the Belgian Army. The combined Allied strength numbered 144 divisions, against Germany's 136. The balance of forces suggested parity, perhaps even Allied advantage. But numbers on an order of battle chart don't account for how those forces are organized, how quickly they can move, or whether their commanders can communicate faster than the enemy can advance. The French Army of 1940 was structurally identical to the French Army of 1918. Same hierarchical command, same methodical planning cycles, same assumption that firepower and fortification could substitute for mobility. It was an army designed to win the previous war, fielded against an enemy who'd spent 2 decades studying how that previous war was lost. The divisions stationed at Sedan conducted their final inspections on the 29th of April. Unit commanders walked the defensive lines, checking fields of fire and communications trenches, noting which bunkers still needed reinforcement and which obstacles remained incomplete. The reports they filed were honest assessments. Defenses were adequate for deterring reconnaissance, insufficient for stopping a determined assault. But deterrence was the expectation. The Ardennes barrier would slow any German advance to a crawl, giving French reserves time to shift north into Belgium, where the real battle would occur. Sedan was a quiet sector, a place where older reservists could man positions without facing the intensity of frontline combat. The assumption was so deeply embedded in French planning that when intelligence reports in late April noted increased German rail traffic toward the Ardennes, analysts classified it as logistical preparation for the Belgian offensive, not evidence of an independent thrust. The reports were filed. The warnings went unheeded. The machine continued processing information into silence. What strikes me, reading through these documents decades later, is not that French commanders were incompetent. Many were highly intelligent, experienced officers, but that they were trapped in an institutional framework that made certain kinds of thinking impossible. When General Gamelin established his headquarters at Vincennes, he chose a facility that had been the French Army's command center in 1914. The same rooms, the same communication systems, the same expectation that modern war would proceed at the pace of telegram delivery. The archive preserves this institutional inertia in uncomfortable detail. Officers who identified problems accurately, filed reports properly, and waited for a response that never arrived because the system was designed to deliberate, not to decide. France didn't enter May 1940 unprepared. France entered May 1940 structurally incapable of responding to preparation's failure. The Phantom Army wasn't the one that didn't exist. It was the one that existed perfectly on paper, but couldn't move fast enough to matter when the paper caught fire. Chapter 2, May 10th, the traffic jam. 4:30 hours, the 10th of May, 1940. A Belgian border guard at the crossing near Aachen heard it first, a low mechanical rumble that grew steadily louder, like distant thunder that refused to fade. Within minutes, the sound resolved into individual engine notes, motorcycle scouts, armored cars, then the distinctive clatter of tracked vehicles moving in column. German forces were crossing the frontier in darkness, pouring into Belgium and the Netherlands in 3 massive spearheads. The guard managed to telephone his command post before the line went dead, cut by German commandos who'd infiltrated hours earlier. By 0500 hours, Belgian military headquarters in Brussels was receiving reports from 17 different crossing points simultaneously. The invasion everyone expected had finally arrived, but its scale and speed exceeded every estimate. This wasn't a probe or a feint. This was everything Germany had, committed in a single thrust. The French response began within minutes of the first Belgian alerts. At 05:15 hours, General Gamelin authorized the execution of Plan D, sending French and British forces racing north into Belgium to establish defensive positions along the Dial River. The plan had been rehearsed for months. Every division knew its route, its assembly area, its final defensive sector. On the maps at GQG, colored arrows showed how the Allied forces would reach the Dial in 48 hours, establishing a continuous front from Antwerp to Namur before German forces could break through Belgian defenses. It looked clean, logical, achievable. Reality hit the roads around 0630 hours, when the French First Army began its movement toward Belgium, and discovered that 40% of the road network was already jammed with civilian refugees. Belgian families who'd fled in 1914, who'd spent 2 decades rebuilding their homes, were fleeing again. They moved south and west in cars, trucks, horse carts, bicycles, and on foot, creating a human flood that no traffic control plan had adequately anticipated. When I overlay the planned movement timetables with the actual road capacity data, the numbers tell a story of geometric impossibility. The primary route from the French border to the Dial River positions measured 127 kilometers. 4 main roads could support this movement, meaning the French First Army's 610,000 men and 87,000 vehicles needed to traverse those routes in less than 48 hours. The mathematics allowed for 1.4 vehicles per minute per road under ideal conditions. Empty roads, no obstacles, no delays. But the roads weren't empty. Belgian refugees reduced effective flow to 0.3 vehicles per minute. A 15-kilometer journey that should have taken 2 hours required 8. Battalions that were supposed to reach their defensive positions by the 11th of May arrived on the 12th, and some not until the 13th. The entire operational tempo of Plan D assumed clear roads and rapid deployment, and both assumptions collapsed in the first 6 hours of execution. The German assault, meanwhile, proceeded with a precision that suggested months of rehearsal. At 0435 hours, glider-borne troops landed on top of Fort Ibn Email, Belgium's most formidable fortress, using hollow charge explosives to destroy the fort's gun cupolas before the Belgian garrison could respond effectively. The fort was designed to withstand artillery bombardment, not commando assault from above, a vulnerability the Germans had identified and exploited with surgical precision. By 0800 hours, the fort's communications were severed, isolating the garrison from higher command. Belgian defensive plans assumed Ibn Email would anchor the northern flank, buying time for Allied reinforcements. Instead, it fell within 36 hours, opening a gap the Germans exploited immediately. The Belgian army fought with courage and determination, but their defensive positions were overrun before French forces could arrive to support them. The coordination Plan D required simply couldn't be achieved at the speed events were unfolding. The Luftwaffe's role in these opening hours deserves its own accounting. German aircraft flew 347 close air support missions on the 10th of May, targeting Belgian defensive positions, bridges, and communications centers. French Army Group 1's intelligence log for that day recorded sporadic air activity, a phrase that reveals the enormous perception gap between what was happening and what French commanders understood was happening. German bombers struck airfields in Belgium, France, and the Netherlands, destroying hundreds of Allied aircraft on the ground before they could scramble. The Armée de l'Air, France's Air Force, lost 139 planes in the first 48 hours, 27 in combat, 112 destroyed on their airfields. French pilots who did manage to take off found themselves outnumbered and out-coordinated. The Luftwaffe operated with forward air controllers, coordinating strikes with ground units, a system France wouldn't adopt until after the war. Air superiority, which French planners assumed would be contested, shifted decisively toward Germany within the first day of combat. At Charleroi, a Belgian crossroads town roughly 40 kilometers from the French border, the traffic chaos reached catastrophic proportions. A traffic control station logged its entries with mechanical precision throughout the 10th of May, each notation documenting another collision, another blocked intersection, another delay cascading through the system. Entry 0547 hours. Breda convoy collision with DLM column. Road blocked. Estimated clear, 4 hours. Someone circled 4 hours 3 times in red pencil, presumably when they realized that 4 hours meant the entire northern movement schedule would collapse. By 1400 hours, the log recorded 17 separate traffic incidents on a single 10-kilometer stretch of road. The officer maintaining the log stopped using proper military time notation around 1600 hours, entries becoming shorter and more frantic. Ambulance stuck, can't move. Fuel truck overturned. Refugees blocking intersection, no police available. The log ends at 2200 hours with a final entry. Situation untenable. Recommend alternative routes. But there were no alternative routes. The road network had a fixed capacity, and demand exceeded it by a factor of 3. The 1st Panzer units, meanwhile, were already across the Belgian border and moving faster than Allied intelligence estimated possible. General Heinz Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps advanced through the Ardennes Forest along roads French planners had declared unsuitable for armored vehicles. At 1420 hours on the 10th of May, German reconnaissance elements reached the Meuse River at Hoe, in the Dinant sector, 72 hours ahead of French intelligence predictions. The report from the French cavalry screen noted limited enemy reconnaissance forces and estimated no significant German presence for at least another 2 days. The estimate was wrong by nearly a week. While French forces were still struggling through traffic jams in Belgium, German armored spearheads had already traversed the supposedly impassable Ardennes and arrived at the river barrier that was meant to give France time to consolidate its defenses. The time had run out before most French commanders realized it was being consumed. To me, the most striking aspect of these first 24 hours isn't the German success, it's the French command's inability to perceive what was happening. General Gamelin issued his "continue as planned" order at 2200 hours on the 10th of May, despite accumulating reports that showed his forces running 14 hours behind schedule. The order wasn't ignorant or blind. It reflected an institutional assumption that plans, once set in motion, had their own momentum that would overcome temporary friction. Gamelin had spent 6 months refining Plan D, conducting staff exercises and map simulations that showed it could work. The reality of blocked roads and destroyed airfields and faster-than-expected German advances didn't immediately register as planned failure. It registered as temporary setbacks requiring perseverance. The archive preserves this disconnect in the daily situation reports from GQG, which maintained optimistic assessments through the 11th and 12th of May, even as frontline units were reporting combat contact far ahead of where German forces were supposed to be. The refugee crisis that choked the roads wasn't a side effect of the invasion. it became a decisive operational factor. By the 12th of May, French authorities estimated 2 million Belgian refugees had crossed into France in 72 hours. They brought stories of Luftwaffe attacks on civilian columns, of German armored cars appearing in Belgian villages without warning, of Belgian defensive lines crumbling faster than anyone anticipated. These refugees weren't just obstacles on the roads. They were evidence of a campaign unfolding at a tempo French planning hadn't accounted for. Military traffic mixed with civilian traffic in an inextricable tangle. Fuel trucks needed to resupply forward units sat motionless for hours. Ammunition convoys missed their delivery windows. Battalion commanders lost contact with their companies because motorcycles couldn't navigate the crowded roads to deliver messages. The elegant choreography Plan D envisioned, simultaneous movements, coordinated timing, forces arriving precisely when needed, dissolved into improvisational chaos that favored the attacker, who knew where he was going, over the defender, who was trying to reach 12 different positions at once. By midnight on the 10th of May, the outlines of France's strategic crisis were visible to anyone examining the situation maps, though few yet grasped its implications. Belgian defenses were crumbling faster than expected. French forces were 12 to 18 hours behind schedule. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. And in the Ardennes, where French intelligence still reported no significant enemy activity, Guderian's entire Panzer Corps was assembling for a crossing of the Meuse that would shatter the French front. The traffic jam that began at dawn had set conditions for catastrophe. France had mobilized millions of men, thousands of tanks, divisions of artillery, and couldn't get them to the battlefield fast enough to matter. The geometry of roads and the arithmetic of time, those mundane logistical realities, were proving more decisive than courage or firepower. The 10th of May wasn't the day France lost, but it was the day the mechanisms that might have saved France began to jam, slowly and inexorably, like a complex machine seizing bolt by bolt under loads it wasn't designed to bear. Chapter 3. The Ardennes, a forest ambush that never happened. The 11th of May 1940, 0600 hours. A French cavalry patrol from the 5th Light Cavalry Division encountered German motorcycle scouts near Neufchâteau, a small Belgian town roughly 40 kilometers into the Ardennes forest. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. A brief exchange of small arms fire before the German scouts withdrew west, deeper into the forest. The French patrol commander filed his report by radio at 0740 hours, describing the contact as limited enemy reconnaissance, estimated platoon strength, moving west toward Bouillon. The report was logged at division headquarters, then forwarded to 2nd Army Command, where it was assessed and categorized. The assessment: no credible threat detected in forest terrain. The report joined dozens of others flowing into French intelligence that morning, each one a small piece of information that, viewed in isolation, suggested nothing alarming. Viewed together, they described something the French High Command couldn't quite believe: a massive German armored force, moving through terrain that doctrine declared impassable. What strikes me about the Ardennes crossing isn't that it happened. It's that French reconnaissance actually observed it happening, and the information was systematically disbelieved. On the 12th of May, French Air Force reconnaissance aircraft flew multiple missions over the Ardennes, photographing German columns moving along Route 4 between Bastogne and Bouillon. One photograph in particular, catalogued as Reconnaissance Photo 412/GR2/33, captured at 11:47 hours, shows a dark stripe running along the forest road. The photo interpreter's report, filed at 1300 hours, labeled this stripe as probable supply convoy, low priority. In 2009, Belgian military historian Mark Rickmanspoel examined the original photograph using modern measurement techniques. He calculated the shadow length of the vehicles in the image, cross-referenced it with the sun angle at that time of day, and determined the convoy represented approximately 41 kilometers of vehicles moving in column. A supply convoy doesn't stretch 41 kilometers. An entire Panzer Corps does. Someone looked directly at Panzer Group Kleist, 70,000 men, 1,200 vehicles, 460 tanks, and filed it as a logistics train. The failure wasn't photographic, it was conceptual. French intelligence analysts in May 1940 operated within a framework of expectations built from 2 decades of study and doctrine. That framework held certain assumptions as fundamental truths. Forests were impassable to armor. Main attacks came through Belgium's central plains. Supply lines constrained operational tempo. When evidence appeared that contradicted these assumptions, the evidence was reinterpreted to fit the framework, rather than challenging the framework itself. The Ardennes forest roads were narrow, winding, and unpaved in many sections, conditions that French engineers had evaluated and deemed unsuitable for sustained mechanized movement. What French planners hadn't fully appreciated was German engineering preparation. Wehrmacht pioneer units had spent months surveying Ardennes routes, identifying choke points, pre-positioning bridging equipment, and planning traffic control procedures. When the invasion began, German military police directed traffic with stopwatch precision, preventing the jams that French planners assumed would naturally occur. The Germans didn't ignore the Ardennes difficulty. They solved it with meticulous logistics. The numbers tell the story more clearly than any after-action report. Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps completed its Ardennes transit with 41,140 vehicles over 3 days, consuming 210,000 liters of fuel, delivered by 1,894 individual fuel trucks. This wasn't improvisation, it was industrial choreography. Each panzer division had assigned routes, designated rest stops, and scheduled refueling points. Traffic moved in pulses. Armored units advanced for 2 hours, then pulled aside to let supply columns pass forward, then resumed movement. The system worked because German planners had accepted the Ardennes constraints and designed their operation within them. French planners, assuming the constraints made the operation impossible, never developed the countermeasures that could have stopped it. French bomber squadrons flew over the Ardennes on the 11th and 12th of May, but struck no targets because standing orders required identifying confirmed enemy concentrations before attacking. The photo interpreter's supply convoy assessment meant the massive traffic jam in the forest didn't qualify as a priority target. It fascinates me how often the archive reveals near misses, moments when the right information reached the right people, just hours too late to matter. On the 12th of May at 15:30 hours, a French Air Force photo interpreter submitted a revised assessment of reconnaissance photo 412, noting that vehicle density appears inconsistent with supply operations, and recommending further reconnaissance. His report reached GQG headquarters at 1800 hours, stamped for review on the 13th of May, because it contradicted the primary intelligence estimate that focused on German operations in central Belgium. By the time staff officers reviewed the report on the morning of the 13th, German panzer units had already crossed the Meuse River at Sedan and established bridgeheads on the west bank. The 48-hour window, when the German columns were most vulnerable, strung out in forest defiles, unable to deploy for combat, concentrated on predictable routes, closed while French command waited for Monday morning to review the weekend intelligence. The French cavalry screens that were supposed to detect and delay German advances in the Ardennes fought with considerable courage but insufficient strength. The 5th Light Cavalry Division deployed 3 regiments across a 60-kilometer front, roughly 1 battalion every 20 kilometers. Their mission was reconnaissance, not defense. Locate enemy forces, report their strength and direction, then fall back to preserve the cavalry for later operations. But the German advance didn't arrive as discrete reconnaissance elements that could be tracked and reported. It arrived as an armored avalanche, panzer divisions advancing on parallel routes, overwhelming cavalry positions through sheer mass. French cavalry officers reported contact, reported German armor, reported themselves being bypassed and encircled. And their reports entered a command system that was still trying to process the battle in Belgium, still moving reserves north toward the Dial River, still operating on the assumption that the Ardennes remained a secondary concern. To me, the most haunting document from the Ardennes phase is a radio log from the 2nd Army headquarters at Sedan, maintained by the signals section with bureaucratic precision. The log entries for the 12th of May begin at 0600 hours with routine traffic, status reports, supply requests, administrative messages. At 10:40 hours, the first report arrives from a cavalry unit in contact with German forces near Bouillon. Enemy armor and strength, estimate regimental size, advancing west. The log notes this message's arrival time, duration, and the staff officer who received it. 2 hours later, another report. Enemy armor crossing Meuse River. Estimate brigade strength. Request air support. Then, at 1600 hours, enemy armor approaching Sedan sector. Estimate divisional strength. Request immediate reinforcement. The estimates escalate with each message, regimental, brigade, divisional, as cavalry units struggled to quantify what they were seeing. The log entries continue through the evening, each one documenting a request that wasn't fulfilled, a warning that wasn't heeded, information flowing upward into a command structure that couldn't process it fast enough to respond. The Luftwaffe's role in the Ardennes deserves specific mention because it contradicts another French assumption, that air reconnaissance would provide adequate warning of any large-scale movement. German fighters flew standing patrols over the Ardennes on the 11th and 12th of May, intercepting French reconnaissance aircraft and preventing sustained observation of the ground situation. Luftwaffe mission logs record 212 close air support sorties on the 12th of May alone, targeting French defensive positions near Sedan in preparation for the river crossing. French Second Army headquarters logged no significant air activity until 1600 hours that day, a 6-hour perception gap that meant German air attacks were hitting bunkers and artillery positions, while French command remained unaware that the preparatory bombardment for a major assault had begun. The Luftwaffe didn't just support the Ardennes operation, it blinded French intelligence to it, creating a bubble of operational invisibility that lasted just long enough to matter. By the evening of the 12th of May, the German advance through the Ardennes was complete. Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps had reached the Meuse River near Sedan, with its combat power largely intact, positioned to attempt a river crossing that French planners assumed couldn't be achieved for at least another week. The French Second Army, responsible for defending the Sedan sector, had received multiple warnings about German armor approaching, but had not received reinforcements because GQG continued to prioritize the Belgian operation. The archive preserves this disconnect in painful detail. Division commanders requesting immediate support, corps commanders forwarding those requests with endorsements, army commanders sending staff officers to GQG to brief the situation in person, and every level of command encountering the same institutional inertia that had ignored the October warnings about Sedan's vulnerability. The system was working as designed, processing information methodically and thoroughly. The Germans were simply operating faster than French methodology could accommodate. What didn't happen in the Ardennes is as significant as what did. There was no French ambush, no prepared demolitions on critical bridges, no artillery fire plans targeting the forest defiles where German columns would be most vulnerable. All of these countermeasures existed in doctrine, all had been discussed in staff planning, but none were executed because executing them required believing the Ardennes was a threat. French General Sard, commanding the 10th Corps at Sedan, was on a scheduled lunch break when the first German elements reached the Meuse on the 12th. He wasn't derelict or incompetent, he was operating on a peacetime schedule, because nothing in the information reaching him suggested the peacetime schedule was about to become catastrophically inappropriate. The photo interpreter who labeled Photo 412 as a supply convoy wasn't wrong in any technical sense. He correctly identified vehicles on a road. He was wrong in a conceptual sense, unable to imagine that the assumptions built into his training might be false. The Ardennes crossing succeeded not because French forces were absent, but because French institutional imagination couldn't encompass the possibility that it would be attempted. By the time reconnaissance photos and cavalry reports accumulated into undeniable evidence, the moment for preventing the crossing had passed. The forest ambush that doctrine said was impossible to execute had been completed by an enemy who'd never read the doctrine. Chapter 4. Sedan, the 14-hour collapse. The 13th of May, 1940, 0700 hours. The Luftwaffe arrived first. Waves of Junkers 87 Stuka dive bombers came in low over the Meuse River valley near Sedan, their distinctive inverted gull wings tilting as they entered their attack dives. Each aircraft mounted a siren on its fixed landing gear, a device with no tactical purpose beyond psychological effect. The sirens produced a distinctive wailing shriek between 250 and 500 hertz, a frequency range that human biology experiences as deeply unsettling, triggering involuntary stress responses. The sound reached the French bunkers before the bombs did. Soldiers manning defensive positions along the Meuse heard it building, a mechanical howl that grew louder until individual aircraft became indistinguishable in the collective noise. Then, the bombs began falling. Not with devastating accuracy. Stukas were precision weapons against stationary targets, but the Sedan bunkers were well-constructed concrete emplacements that could withstand anything short of direct hits. Most bombs fell on open ground between positions, cratering fields and severing telephone wires but leaving the fortifications intact. The bombardment killed 56 French soldiers in the first 2 hours. It broke the will of hundreds more. When I examine the damage assessments conducted after the battle, the numbers reveal something unexpected. 83% of French bunkers in the Sedan sector remained structurally intact after the Luftwaffe bombardment. The guns were still operational, the fields of fire still clear, the positions still defensible. But by 1600 hours that afternoon, most of those bunkers had been abandoned. The Stuka sirens, that deliberate psychological weapon, achieved what high explosive couldn't. French soldiers in the bunkers reported an inability to think clearly, a sensation of overwhelming dread that made coordinated action nearly impossible. The acoustic assault, combined with the physical concussion of near-miss explosions, created what modern military psychology would recognize as acute combat stress reaction. Soldiers experienced it as paralysis, as a conviction that remaining in position meant certain death. One telephone log from the 55th Infantry Division headquarters, maintained by an operator who recorded every incoming call that morning, captures the progression of psychological collapse in real time. The log begins at 0700 hours with routine status reports. 0930. Battalion commander reports heavy bombardment, no casualties, positions intact. 01015. Company commander requests permission to withdraw, negative response. 01140. Multiple calls, lines to 2nd Battalion down, 3rd Battalion reporting bombardment continuing, 4th Battalion, no contact. By 1300 hours, the handwriting in the log begins to deteriorate. Entries become shorter, less formal. 1400 hours. Bunker 7 reports German infantry crossing river in boats. Request artillery support. 1420. No contact Bunker 7. 1445. Lieutenant Delestraint reports Bunker 6 abandoned. Personnel whereabouts unknown. 1647 hours. Lieutenant Delestraint requests permission withdraw. The entry stops mid-sentence. Subsequent entries show different handwriting, suggesting the original operator fled his post. The log doesn't end with a formal closing entry. It just stops, somewhere between 1700 and 1800 hours. The final page is blank except for coffee stains and the impression of someone's palm pressed hard against the paper. The German assault across the Meuse began at 1200 hours, after 5 hours of continuous air bombardment. Assault engineers from the 1st Infantry Regiment launched rubber boats from the east bank, paddling across a river roughly 70 meters wide, with a current flowing at approximately 1.2 meters per second. French defenders in the intact bunkers opened fire, 75mm guns and machine guns engaging at ranges under 200 meters. The first wave of boats suffered severe casualties. 3 boats were destroyed by direct hits, their crews killed before reaching mid-river. German after-action reports acknowledge heavy defensive fire and note that initial casualties exceeded planning estimates. But the covering Stuka attacks had suppressed most of the French artillery, and the few guns still firing couldn't adjust their fire because observation posts had lost telephone contact with gun positions. Artillery officers watched German boats crossing their sectors, but couldn't call for fire missions. They could only watch. By 1400 hours, German infantry had established footholds on the west bank at 3 separate crossing points. These weren't secure positions. Small groups of soldiers huddled against riverbanks, pinned down by machine gun fire from bunkers that were still operational. French defensive doctrine called for immediate counterattacks to eliminate bridgeheads before they could be reinforced. The 213th Infantry Regiment began such a counterattack at 1500 hours, advancing with 2 battalions toward the German positions. They reached within 400 meters of the river before their commander ordered a withdrawal. The withdrawal order wasn't triggered by combat losses. Casualties at that point were moderate. It was triggered by reports of enemy tank breakthrough that hadn't actually occurred. German tanks were still on the east bank, waiting for engineers to complete a pontoon bridge. But the psychological impact of 5 hours of Stuka attacks, combined with intermittent reports of German armor throughout the day, created an expectation of panzer assault. When the 213th's commander received unconfirmed reports of tanks crossing, He assumed his infantry would be overrun without anti-tank support and pulled back to preserve his units. The counterattack that might have sealed the bridgehead dissolved based on a threat that didn't yet exist. The tonnage of ordnance the Luftwaffe dropped on Sedan that day, 247 tons distributed across a 55-kilometer sector, translates to 4.5 tons per kilometer of front. But 89% of that tonnage concentrated on an 8-kilometer section where German forces intended to cross, creating a density of psychological pressure that French defenders experienced as apocalyptic. The actual destructive effect was modest. Post-battle engineering surveys showed that German bombs destroyed fewer than 15% of French defensive positions. But destruction wasn't the bombardment's purpose. Disruption was. Severed communications meant battalion commanders couldn't coordinate with their companies. Destroyed telephone lines meant artillery observers couldn't request fire missions. Suppressed defenders meant machine gunners stayed in their bunkers rather than manning their weapons. The Luftwaffe didn't need to destroy the Sedan defenses. It needed to create a 4-hour window of paralysis while German engineers built bridges, and it achieved that with remarkable precision. At 18:30 hours, General Lafontaine, commanding the 55th Division, requested permission from General Gransard to withdraw his forces to secondary defensive positions 3 kilometers west of the river. Gransard approved the request, despite no German units having yet crossed the Meuse in strength. The bridgehead comprised roughly 2,000 infantry, with minimal heavy weapons. But Lafontaine's assessment, based on reports filtering up through his command structure, was that the primary defensive line had already failed. His division had suffered approximately 280 casualties from bombing and small arms fire, a loss rate of less than 2%, but unit cohesion had dissolved. Companies reported missing officers, sections reported abandoned positions, battalion commanders reported inability to re-establish contact with their subordinates. The 55th Division hadn't been destroyed. It had been disassembled, taken apart piece by psychological pressure that exceeded its institutional resilience. To me, the most revealing aspect of Sedan isn't the speed of the collapse, but the mechanical precision of German timing. The Luftwaffe's 5-hour bombardment ended at exactly 1200 hours, the moment assault boats entered the water. Engineers began constructing the first pontoon bridge at 1800 hours, working under sporadic French artillery fire that was heavy enough to inflict casualties, but not concentrated enough to halt construction. The bridge reached completion at 2340 hours, a 16-ton capacity structure capable of supporting Panzer Mark III tanks. The first German tank crossed at 0100 hours on the 14th of May, 14 hours after the bombardment began. Every phase of the German operation had been choreographed to flow into the next, each element supporting the others in a sequence that assumed French resistance would follow predictable patterns. The assumption proved correct. French doctrine called for holding river lines, then conducting methodical counterattacks with armor support once the situation was assessed. By the time French armor arrived to counterattack, German tanks were already crossing the bridge, turning what should have been a counterattack into a meeting engagement that favored German tactical doctrine. The collapse accelerated through the night of the 13th and into the 14th. French artillery that had stopped firing at 1920 hours, not because gun positions were destroyed, but because ammunition trucks failed to arrive. Their drivers, having fled the area during the Stuka attacks, never resumed fire. The guns sat silent, with intact crews standing by, waiting for ammunition that didn't come. Infantry units that withdrew to secondary positions found those positions unoccupied and unprepared, because French defensive planning had concentrated resources on the primary river line. Within 24 hours of the bombardment's start, German forces had penetrated 15 kilometers into the French rear, advancing through territory that had seen no combat, no defensive preparation, no obstacles beyond the occasional roadblock that German motorcycle scouts bypassed or eliminated. The breach wasn't achieved through overwhelming the defenders with firepower. It was achieved by finding the exact sequence of pressures, acoustic, explosive, temporal, that French institutional resilience couldn't withstand. What fascinates me about the telephone log from the 55th Division is how it captures institutional dissolution in bureaucratic language. The early entries use proper military format: unit designation, time, message content, action taken. As the day progresses, the format decays. Entries lose their structure, becoming fragmentary. Heavy fire, request support, no contact. The language simplifies as the situation deteriorates, as if the operator's capacity for formal communication degrades along with the defensive situation. The handwriting tells its own story, steady and clear in the morning, increasingly hurried and erratic by afternoon, finally illegible by evening. Reading the log feels like watching a mind unravel, each entry less coherent than the last, until the capacity to record information itself fails. The log doesn't end with a final situation report, or a formal notation that the command post has relocated. It simply stops, mid-sentence, the pen abandoned mid-word. Somewhere in that silence between the last entry and the blank pages that follow, the 55th Infantry Division ceased to function as a military organization. The archive preserves this moment with unintentional precision, the death of unit cohesion documented in the space where writing should be, but isn't. Chapter 5. The Char B-1, When Superior Tanks Don't Matter. The 14th of May, 1940, 0600 hours. The maintenance compound of the 15th Tank Battalion, 3rd Armored Division, located roughly 30 kilometers southwest of the developing crisis at Sedan. Morning inspection revealed what battalion mechanics already knew. Of 62 Char B-1 bis heavy tanks assigned to the division, only 45 were operational. The rest sat in various states of mechanical distress: fuel pump failures, transmission problems, coolant leaks, electrical faults. The Char B-1 bis was, on paper, the most formidable tank in Western Europe. 31.5 metric tons of armor and firepower, mounting both a 75mm hull gun and a 47mm turret gun, with armor thick enough to shrug off any German anti-tank weapon then in service. French tankers called it the Monster. German Panzer commanders who'd encountered it in combat called it the Coffin Hammer, a vehicle they feared and couldn't reliably destroy. But superiority on the battlefield begins with arriving at the battlefield, and the Char B-1 bis spent more time broken than ready. The maintenance logs tell a story of systemic failure, more damning than any combat report. Each Char B-1 battalion was supposed to maintain 80% operational readiness, roughly 50 tanks combat ready from a 62-tank authorization. Achieving that readiness required 4.2 metric tons of spare parts per battalion per month. Track links, fuel pump seals, transmission gears, coolant system components, electrical wiring, and hundreds of smaller items that kept the complex machine functioning. French logistics planning allocated 1.1 tons of spares per battalion per month, based on peacetime maintenance rates and an assumption that wartime demands wouldn't significantly increase. The shortfall meant battalions entered the campaign already operating below optimal readiness, then watched that readiness decay as combat operations stressed mechanical systems beyond peacetime parameters. When the 3rd Armored Division received movement orders on the morning of the 14th, directing it to counterattack German bridgeheads at Sedan, mechanics worked frantically to bring as many B-1s to operational status as possible. They achieved 45 tanks ready from 62 authorized, 73% readiness, adequate for peacetime exercises, but marginal for combat operations. When I cross-reference the fuel consumption data with the forward logistics planning, the numbers reveal an operation doomed before it began. Each Char B-1 bis consumed 174 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers traveled, roughly twice the consumption of a Panzer III. The tanks required fuel from specialized trucks carrying aviation-grade gasoline, because the B-1's engine couldn't tolerate the lower-octane motor fuel used by standard vehicles. On the 14th of May, the route from the 3rd Armored Division's assembly area to the Sedan combat zone measured 73 kilometers. A one-way trip consumed approximately 127 liters per tank. The approach march, plus anticipated combat maneuvering, required fuel reserves of at least 200 liters per vehicle. French logistics had positioned fuel dumps every 50 kilometers along major routes, each dump stocked with 50,000 liters of aviation gasoline. On the morning of the 14th, Luftwaffe bombers struck 3 of the 4 dumps along the 3rd Armored's route, destroying an estimated 130,000 liters of fuel. The remaining dump, located near Stone, held 42,000 liters, enough to refuel 96 tanks once. The division's 45 operational tanks could refuel, but only if they arrived before the fuel ran out, and only if no other units drew from the same supply. The counterattack began at 0830 hours. 45 Char B-1 bis tanks advancing through morning mist toward the village of Stone, which German forces had seized during the night. The tactical situation favored the French, attacking down a ridgeline with good visibility, against German infantry and light tanks that lacked weapons capable of penetrating B-1 armor frontally. The first combat contact occurred at 09:15 hours, when B-1 number 392, Lorraine, commanded by Captain Pierre Bilot, encountered a German defensive position on Stone's eastern approach. What followed became one of the day's few moments of French tactical success, preserved in both French and German after-action reports with remarkable consistency. Lorraine engaged 13 German tanks, a mix of Panzer Mark IIs and Mark IIIs, at ranges between 200 and 800 meters. The B-1's superior armor allowed Bilot to advance deliberately, firing the hull gun at distant targets while the turret gun engaged closer threats. German return fire sparked and ricocheted off Lorraine's armor without achieving penetration. Within 15 minutes, Bilot's crew had destroyed or disabled all 13 German tanks, plus 2 anti-tank guns that had attempted to engage from enfilade positions. But individual tactical excellence couldn't compensate for operational deficiency. At 1000 hours, after 90 minutes of combat, Lorraine withdrew from the fight, not due to damage, but because the tank had expended its primary ammunition load of 42 75mm rounds. The B-1's ammunition storage, designed for the methodical warfare of 1918, couldn't support the rapid engagement tempo of 1940 combat. Bilot's crew withdrew to rearm, a process that should have taken 30 minutes, but stretched to 3 hours because the division's ammunition trucks were caught in traffic jams created by refugee columns on the approach roads. By 1300 hours, when Lorraine returned to combat, German reinforcements had arrived. Panzer Regiment 1 with heavier tanks and coordinated artillery support. The tactical advantage the French had held during the morning engagement evaporated in the face of German combined arms coordination. The broader counterattack fared worse. Of 45 B-1 tanks that began the assault, 27 withdrew by 1200 hours for refueling. The fuel dump at Stone had been designed to service 50 tanks. The sudden arrival of additional French armored units overwhelmed its capacity. Tanks queued for fuel, waiting in exposed positions while German observers called in artillery fire. The refueling process itself consumed time the tactical situation couldn't afford. Each B-1 required 340 liters to achieve operational range, pumped from 50-liter jerry cans by hand. Simple arithmetic: 7 jerry cans per tank, roughly 4 minutes per can, including the time to fetch, pour, and secure each container. 28 minutes minimum per tank, multiplied by 45 tanks, equals 21 hours of refueling time, even with perfect efficiency and no interruptions. The actual refueling operation required 6 hours because fuel trucks arrived intermittently, jerry cans had to be distributed, and the process occurred under sporadic German artillery fire that forced periodic dispersal. By 1800 hours on the 14th, only 17 B-1 tanks remained combat ready. The rest sat immobilized by fuel exhaustion or mechanical failure. To me, the most damning evidence comes from German intelligence reports compiled after they captured several intact Char B-1 tanks at Stone. Wehrmacht technical teams examined the vehicles and found them mechanically sophisticated but operationally fragile. The fuel system required 2 separate fuel pumps, main and auxiliary, with a manual priming procedure that took 12 minutes and required the crew to access external valves while exposed outside the tank. The May 1940 production run suffered from a known defect in glycol coolant seals that caused progressive leaks, degrading engine performance after 6 to 8 hours of operation. The gyroscopic turret stabilizer, intended to improve gunnery accuracy, frequently malfunctioned under field conditions, requiring manual traverse that was slower and less precise. Every technical advantage the B-1 possessed came with a corresponding maintenance burden that French logistics couldn't support. German examiners noted with particular interest that many captured B-1s had been abandoned, not due to combat damage, but due to mechanical failure, crews walking away from tanks that were theoretically operational but practically unusable. The 3rd Armored Division's operations summary for the 14th of May lists 45 tanks deployed, 13 destroyed by enemy action, 19 withdrawn for mechanical reasons, 8 withdrawn for fuel exhaustion. The arithmetic leaves 5 tanks still engaged at day's end, 11% of the starting strength. This ratio, mechanical attrition exceeding combat losses by 3 to 1, characterized French armored operations throughout the campaign. The Char B-1Bs proved everything its designers promised in individual engagements, demonstrating armor protection and firepower that German tanks couldn't match. But war isn't fought in individual engagements. It's fought in sustained operations, where mechanical reliability and logistical support determine whether theoretical superiority translates to operational effectiveness. France possessed the better tank. Germany possessed the better tank system, vehicles designed within sustainable maintenance parameters, logistics organized to support operational tempo, doctrine that accepted each tank's limitations and employed them accordingly. By the 16th of May, the 3rd Armored Division's operational strength had fallen from 45 tanks to 17. No major battle had occurred to explain this decline. Instead, tanks simply broke down. Track links fractured, fuel pumps failed, coolant leaks became severe enough to risk engine damage. Transmissions that had functioned adequately during peacetime exercises failed under the stress of combat maneuvering. The division's maintenance company worked continuously, but spare parts arrived irregularly and in insufficient quantities. A tank that threw a track required replacement links that might arrive in 6 hours or 60 hours, or not at all, depending on whether supply trucks could navigate roads clogged with refugees, and whether those trucks carried the specific parts needed. Modern military logistics calls this supply chain fragility, the vulnerability created when complex systems depend on precise coordination of numerous small components. French armored logistics exhibited extreme fragility, and the chaos of May 1940 shattered it completely. What fascinates me most is how the maintenance logs preserve a parallel narrative to the combat reports, one that's less dramatic but more determinative. While battle summaries describe tactical engagements and strategic movements, maintenance logs record the mundane mechanical reality. B1 number 403 Vendée, fuel pump failure, 0840 hours. Replacement unavailable. Crew transferred to B1 number 391, which requires carburetor cleaning, estimated 3 hours. Net operational tanks this morning, 4 of 12. The log continues for 73 pages, each entry a small mechanical defeat that accumulated into operational paralysis. Reading these logs decades later, I'm struck by their tone, not panicked or desperate, just methodically recording a situation deteriorating beyond their capacity to fix. The mechanics knew they were losing a race against mechanical entropy. The logs show them documenting the loss with professional precision, noting each failure, each unavailable part, each tank that left operational status and didn't return. France's most powerful weapon, the tool that should have blunted the German advance, broke down faster than German shells could destroy it. The archive preserves this truth in maintenance reports that nobody wanted to write, and that few afterward wanted to read. Chapter 6. The Meuse Bridgehead, Engineers Under Fire. The 13th of May, 1940, 1600 hours. The western bank of the Meuse River near Gaulle, roughly 6 kilometers south of Sedan, 1st Pioneer Battalion, Wehrmacht engineering troops, began unloading prefabricated pontoon sections from trucks that had followed the Panzer advance through the Ardennes. The engineers worked under intermittent French artillery fire, 75mm shells that burst in the soft ground with irregular frequency, suggesting fire from batteries that lacked proper targeting coordinates. The battalion's mission was precise: construct a 16-ton capacity pontoon bridge across the Meuse, capable of supporting Panzer Mark III and Mark IV tanks, completed before midnight. The river at this crossing point measured 180 meters wide, with a current flowing at approximately 1.2 meters per second. German engineer manuals specified that a bridge of this type required 24 pneumatic pontoons, 180 meters of decking timber, pre-cut to 4.2-meter sections, steel cable for anchoring, and approximately 2,100 man-hours of labor under ideal conditions. These weren't ideal conditions. The after-action report from 1st Pioneer Battalion, filed 3 days later when the immediate tactical crisis had passed, provides detail that transforms the Sedan breakthrough from mythic blitzkrieg to industrial problem-solving. The report's tone is matter-of-fact, almost bureaucratic, noting casualties and construction progress with the same clinical precision. Commenced bridge construction 1600 hours, site designated Bridge B, location, Meuse River kilometer marker 174.2. Initial assembly West Bank pontoon storage area. French artillery fire intermittent, estimated battery strength 3 guns. Ranging fire suggests forward observers absent or suppressed. First pontoon positioned 16:35 hours. Direct hit on assembly area 17:15 hours. 4 casualties. 1 pontoon section damaged. Timber stockpile intact due to terrain defilade. Construction continued. The report runs for 11 pages, each paragraph documenting another technical problem solved or casualty absorbed while the work continued. Someone added a pencil notation at the report's end. Engineers did the impossible. Panzers just drove across. When I examine the bridge construction timeline against the tactical situation, what emerges is a story of institutional competence under pressure. The German engineers weren't performing superhuman feats. They were executing a well-rehearsed procedure they'd practiced dozens of times during pre-war training. Each pioneer company included soldiers who'd worked in civilian construction, who understood load calculations and stress analysis, who could look at a river's current and estimate where to position anchoring cables. The Wehrmacht had invested heavily in engineer training, precisely for this moment, understanding that river crossings would determine whether the armored advance could sustain momentum. French defensive doctrine anticipated river crossings, but assumed they'd require days of preparation, allowing time for defenders to mass artillery fires and counterattacks. The Germans compressed days into hours through preparation so thorough it appeared magical. The technical challenges were substantial. Each pneumatic pontoon needed to support precisely calculated weight while accounting for current pressure and wind loading. The decking timbers, cut to standardized 4.2-meter lengths, had to be positioned with minimal gaps to prevent track links from catching and damaging individual sections. Anchoring cables required positioning upstream and downstream to prevent the current from pushing the bridge laterally during tank crossings. German engineering manuals included slide rule calculations for these variables, equations factoring water density, current speed, pontoon buoyancy, and bridge loading. Pioneer officers carried these manuals and slide rules into combat, treating bridge construction as an applied physics problem that required precision even under artillery fire. A 15% miscalculation in buoyancy would cause the bridge to ride too low in the water, allowing waves to wash over the deck and destabilize crossing tanks. The engineers couldn't afford approximations. French artillery fire intensified around 1800 hours, a brief surge of concentrated shelling that suggested an observer had finally established communication with gun batteries. The Pioneer Battalion's casualty log records 7 men killed and 23 wounded during a 40-minute period when French shells walked through the construction site with methodical precision. But the shelling ceased at 1920 hours, not because French gunners chose to stop, but because French ammunition trucks had failed to arrive, having been caught in the same refugee traffic that was paralyzing French logistics throughout the campaign. The sudden silence allowed German engineers to work uninterrupted for the next 4 hours, the most critical phase of construction, when the bridge had to be stabilized and load tested. German planning hadn't counted on French ammunition shortages. It had simply designed the operation with enough redundancy to absorb various forms of interference and still complete on schedule. Bridge B reached completion at 23:40 hours, 420 minutes of construction under combat conditions. The engineering achievement becomes clearer when examining the arithmetic. 2,100 man-hours of labor, compressed into 7 hours, equals 300 men working simultaneously, organized into specialized teams: pontoon assembly, timber deck installation, cable anchoring, quality control inspection. 1st Pioneer Battalion deployed 280 soldiers to the bridge site, supplemented by infantry pressed into service as laborers. The organization required to coordinate this work, tool distribution, material flow, task sequencing, casualty replacement, demanded the kind of institutional competence that comes only from extensive training and realistic exercises. Wehrmacht pioneer units had spent the winter of 1939 conducting bridge-building drills in German rivers, timing each phase, identifying bottlenecks, refining procedures. That winter training paid forward in the spring darkness on the Meuse, where engineers worked by moonlight and vehicle headlights, assembling a bridge that appeared in French reconnaissance photographs the next morning like a conjuring trick. To me, the most revealing aspect of the bridge construction isn't German efficiency, but French absence. At 0400 hours on the 14th of May, a French counterattack could have destroyed Bridge B with a single concentrated artillery strike. The bridge at that hour was functional but fragile, carrying its first tanks across and vulnerable to any sustained fire. French artillery batteries possessed the range. Guns positioned 6 kilometers west of the river could reach the crossing site with observed fire. But French forward observers had withdrawn during the previous day's Stuka attacks, and battalion commanders had pulled back 6 kilometers to establish new defensive lines. That withdrawal placed the bridge outside the range of observed fire, forcing French artillery to shoot blind or not at all. They chose not at all. The opportunity window lasted 42 minutes, the time between the 1st Panzer Mark III crossing and the establishment of German anti-aircraft positions that would make close observation suicidal. 42 minutes, when a French lieutenant with a radio and a forward observer could have changed the campaign's trajectory. The archive shows no evidence anyone tried. The 1st Panzer crossed at 0240 hours on the 14th of May. The battalion engineering officer insisted on personally riding the first tank across to verify structural integrity, a detail preserved in both the German engineering report and the Panzer Regiment's war diary. The bridge settled approximately 8 centimeters under the tank's weight, well within acceptable parameters for a pontoon structure. Crossing speed was restricted to 5 kilometers per hour to minimize wave action and structural stress. Simple division: a 180-meter bridge at 5 kilometers per hour requires 2.1 minutes per crossing. Panzer Regiment 1 needed to cross 87 tanks plus supporting vehicles. Theoretical minimum crossing time, 3 hours. Actual crossing time, 18 hours, because the bridge became a choke point where multiple panzer divisions converged, creating traffic jams that German military police managed with stopwatch discipline and sometimes physical force. The engineering effort continued beyond bridge completion. Pioneer units established ferry points upstream and downstream for lighter vehicles, constructed approaches to minimize bank erosion, positioned rafts for infantry crossing, and began work on a second bridge, Bridge C, 2 kilometers north. By noon on the 14th, German forces had established 3 separate Meuse crossing points in the Sedan sector, each one expanding the bridgehead and pulling more French defensive attention away from the primary penetration. The bridges weren't tactical improvisations. They were elements of a pre-planned crossing operation that assumed French resistance would be heavy and that redundancy would be necessary. When French resistance proved lighter than expected, the redundant crossing points became avenues for rapid exploitation. What fascinates me most about the German engineering reports is their mundane specificity. They document not heroic achievement, but professional competence. Timber stockpile, positioned 200 meters west of riverbank. Defilated by terrain fold, accessible via farm track. Pontoon assembly conducted in covered area. Moved to river by 8-man teams using pre-positioned rollers. Cable anchoring points surveyed and marked during daylight reconnaissance 13th May. Every sentence describes preparation, not improvisation. The bridges appeared quickly because the work had been planned meticulously, rehearsed extensively, and executed by soldiers who understood both the technical requirements and the tactical urgency. German engineers didn't perform miracles at Sedan. They performed engineering, under fire, with the institutional support and training necessary to make engineering possible, even when French shells were falling. The archive preserves their work in after-action reports that read like construction project documentation, each page proving that modern war's decisive moments often belong not to generals or tank commanders, but to specialists with slide rules and pontoons, solving industrial problems while the world burns around them. Chapter 7. Counterattack at Montcornet, de Gaulle's Theorem. The 16th of May, 1940, 0400 hours. A farmhouse near Laon, roughly 60 kilometers southwest of the developing catastrophe at Sedan, temporarily serving as headquarters for what French military documents optimistically called the 4th Armored Division. Colonel Charles de Gaulle, recently promoted and given command of a division that existed primarily on organizational charts, sat reviewing personnel rosters by lamplight. The 4th DCR, Division Cuirassé de Reserve, had been authorized on the 15th of May, assembled from scattered tank battalions that had survived the initial German onslaught. De Gaulle's diary entry for that night, preserved in his post-war memoirs, captures both the absurdity and the determination of his situation. Received command of 4th Armored. Division exists on paper only. 200 tanks scattered across 40 kilometers. I have 36 hours to create an operational force. The High Command wants a demonstration. I intend violence. The word violence is underlined twice in the original manuscript, suggesting either emphasis or frustration, or perhaps both. What strikes me about de Gaulle's Montcornet operation isn't its tactical outcome. The attack failed to achieve strategic objectives, but what it revealed about French institutional paralysis. De Gaulle understood intuitively what French doctrine couldn't accommodate, that concentrated armor, employed aggressively, could disrupt German operations even when the strategic situation appeared hopeless. His challenge was assembling that concentration from units that belonged to different commands, operated different tank models, and had never trained together. The 4th DCR's initial order of battle included elements from 3 separate armored battalions, 2 independent tank companies, and an assortment of support units cobbled together from retreating formations. On paper, this force comprised roughly 214 tanks. In reality, de Gaulle could locate and communicate with 150, of which approximately 90 were operational when he began his attack on the 17th of May. The tanks themselves represented France's armored diversity in miniature. 68 Char B1 bis heavy tanks, the same vehicles that had fought at Stone with such mechanical difficulty. 50 Hotchkiss H-35 light tanks, adequate for reconnaissance, but mounting only a 37mm gun with limited anti-armor capability. 32 Renault R-35 infantry support tanks, even more lightly armed and agonizingly slow, with a maximum speed of 20 kilometers per hour. De Gaulle's division had 3 different tank types, with 3 different maximum speeds, 3 different fuel consumption rates, and 3 incompatible radio systems. Most of the H-35s and R-35s had no radios at all, relying on flag signals for coordination. German panzer divisions achieved tactical cohesion through standardization. De Gaulle was attempting the same with equipment so diverse it defied coordinated employment. That he achieved anything at all speaks to his operational vision and his tankers' determination. The attack began at 0630 hours on the 17th of May, advancing north toward Montcornet, with the objective of cutting German supply lines that intelligence reported running through the town. De Gaulle concentrated his Char B1s as the spearhead, supported by lighter tanks in echelon, advancing on a 4-kilometer front, a density of 53.5 tanks per kilometer, the highest Allied tank concentration achieved during the entire campaign. German supply columns, caught in open country during their movement forward, scattered under French fire. After-action reports from the German 1st Panzer Division, whose supply trains were operating in the area, confirm surprise attack by French armor, approximately battalion strength, from southwest. 6 fuel trucks destroyed, ammunition convoy dispersed, supply route temporarily interdicted. For approximately 2 hours, de Gaulle's attack achieved exactly what he intended: disruption of German logistics at a moment when panzer divisions were outrunning their supply infrastructure. But 2 hours was all he got. At 0800 hours, the Luftwaffe arrived. Stuka dive bombers redirected from close air support missions near Sedan to deal with the unexpected French armor concentration. De Gaulle had no air support. His request for fighter cover, filed through proper channels at Army Group headquarters, was processing through the approval system when German aircraft began their attacks. The Stukas couldn't destroy the Char B1s. Their armor proved resistant to anything short of direct hits. But they didn't need to destroy them. They needed to stop them. And the psychological effect of repeated dive-bombing attacks achieved that. French tank crews, operating without infantry support or anti-aircraft weapons, couldn't advance while under air attack. They could only halt, button up their hatches, and endure. By 1000 hours, the momentum de Gaulle had generated through surprise and concentration had dissipated under Luftwaffe interdiction. The absence of combined arms support reveals the institutional constraints de Gaulle was fighting against. German panzer divisions operated as integrated formations. Tanks, mechanized infantry, artillery, engineers, and forward air controllers, all trained to work together. French armored doctrine still treated tanks as infantry support weapons, attached to infantry divisions rather than concentrated in independent formations. De Gaulle's 4th DCR had tanks but minimal infantry, 2 companies of motorized infantry, comprising roughly 350 soldiers, tasked with supporting 200 tanks. French doctrine called for infantry-to-tank ratios of approximately 3-to-1. De Gaulle was operating at ratios closer to 1-to-1. Without infantry to clear anti-tank positions, occupy captured territory, or protect tanks during halts, his armor was vulnerable to exactly the kind of combined arms response the Germans employed. He understood this limitation. His diary entries from the 17th mention repeatedly that he's demonstrating the possible, while the tools to make it probable remain scattered across France's collapsing command structure. De Gaulle withdrew by 1200 hours, having advanced roughly 8 kilometers, destroyed German supply vehicles, and briefly threatened German logistics. He'd also lost 15 tanks, 3 to mechanical failure, 4 to German anti-tank guns, 8 abandoned when they ran out of fuel. The fuel shortage particularly galled him. His attack had been planned with fuel dumps positioned at specific locations along the axis of advance. But the dumps were never established because the fuel trucks were caught in traffic. French logistics assumed tanks would operate tethered to infantry divisions, moving at walking pace, not ranging independently at speeds exceeding 30 kilometers per hour. De Gaulle's operational concept required logistical support that French systems weren't designed to provide, and the improvised nature of his division meant nobody had authority to commandeer the resources he needed. He tried again on the 19th of May, attacking toward Crécy-sur-Serre with 140 tanks, attrition and mechanical failure having reduced his operational strength. This second attack achieved similar results: initial surprise, tactical gains, German supply disruption, then collapse under Luftwaffe attack and lack of support. German war diaries note these attacks with a mix of respect and relief. Respect for French tactical execution, relief that the attacks weren't being coordinated at operational scale. Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps was vulnerable during this period, its forward elements having outrun supply lines and operating with minimal reserves. A coordinated French counteroffensive, employing multiple armored divisions with air support and proper logistics, might have severed the Panzer corridor and trapped German spearheads west of the Meuse. But France possessed no mechanism for generating such a counteroffensive. The command structure that might have coordinated multiple divisions was still trying to understand what had happened at Sedan, still moving reserves toward Belgium, still processing the campaign through a decision cycle measured in days, while events unfolded in hours. To me, de Gaulle's Montcornet diary entry, "We have demonstrated the possible, but high command prepares to declare it impossible," reads like prophecy written in real time. His attacks proved that concentrated armor could disrupt German operations, that aggressive action could exploit enemy vulnerabilities, that France possessed the material capability to contest the campaign's outcome. They also proved that tactical excellence without institutional support achieves only local, temporary results. De Gaulle commanded 1 division. France fielded 3 DCRs, plus multiple independent tank battalions, enough armored strength to have mounted the kind of operational counteroffensive that might have sealed the Sedan breach. But those forces were scattered, subordinated to infantry corps, employed piecemeal in defensive roles that negated their mobility advantage. The institutional framework that had created the Char B1Bs, that had recognized armor's potential, couldn't yet imagine employing that armor the way de Gaulle was demonstrating it needed to be employed. What fascinates me most is the timeline. De Gaulle conducted his Montcornet attacks on the 17th and 19th of May. France didn't appoint him Under-Secretary of State for War until the 6th of June, didn't give him authority to influence armored doctrine at the national level until the campaign was effectively over. His division, the one formation that demonstrated how French armor might have been employed, received no reinforcements, no priority for supplies, no expansion of mission beyond local counterattacks that higher command viewed as desperate gestures rather than operational templates. The archive preserves this missed opportunity in painful detail. War diaries showing de Gaulle identifying enemy vulnerabilities, staff reports showing his requests for support being processed through normal channels at normal speed, intelligence summaries showing German commanders concerned about his attacks but relieved when they weren't reinforced or repeated. France had the theorem. De Gaulle had written it in fire and steel near Montcornet, but the institutions that might have scaled that theorem to operational significance couldn't move fast enough to matter. By the time French command recognized what de Gaulle had demonstrated, the opportunity to exploit it had passed. buried under the advancing weight of German divisions that understood combined arms warfare not as theory, but as practiced reality. Chapter 8. The Dunkirk Decision. Hitler's Halt Order. The 24th of May, 1940, 11:30 hours. The Führer Hauptquartier Felsennest, Hitler's field headquarters near the Belgian border, where a decision was about to be made that would alter the campaign's trajectory in ways nobody present fully understood. General Franz Halder, chief of the German Army General Staff, sat in a briefing room, reviewing situation maps that showed German panzer divisions positioned along the Aue Canal, roughly 12 kilometers from Dunkirk. The British Expeditionary Force, Belgian Army, and remnants of French First Army were compressed into a shrinking pocket, their backs to the sea, their escape routes narrowing with each hour. Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps was ready to advance. Fuel trucks were forward. Ammunition was adequate. The route to Dunkirk was open. Then the order arrived from Hitler. Halt the panzers at the canal line. Allow the infantry to close up. Let the Luftwaffe finish the pocket from the air. Halder's diary entry for that afternoon, written with unusual emotional force, preserves his reaction. Führer orders halt at Aue Canal. Panzers to refit. Göring claims Luftwaffe can destroy pocket alone. I calculate this delay allows 4 British divisions to reach perimeter. This is madness disguised as confidence. The halt order has generated more historical controversy than perhaps any other decision of the campaign. 3 different explanations exist in the archives, each supported by primary sources, each potentially valid, each revealing different aspects of German command dysfunction. Hitler's stated justification, recorded in his conference notes, emphasized preserving armor for fall rot. Case read, the planned offensive against remaining French forces south of the Somme. The panzers had been in continuous combat since the 10th of May. Mechanical wear was accumulating, and tank losses, though modest by later war standards, were sufficient to concern German logistics planners. Preserving armor strength for the next phase made operational sense. But Halder's diary suggests political calculation. Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, wanted his service to claim credit for destroying the Allied pocket, enhancing the Luftwaffe's prestige at the Army's expense. Hitler, sensitive to inter-service rivalries and personally closer to Göring than to the Army High Command, may have allowed air power advocates to override ground commanders' recommendations. The third explanation appears in Army Group A commander Gerd von Rundstedt's post-war memoir, where he claims he requested the halt due to concerns about supply lines and vulnerable flanks. Rundstedt's armor had advanced 300 kilometers in 14 days, creating a narrow corridor with exposed southern flank, where French forces were attempting counterattacks. His concern about overextension wasn't irrational. De Gaulle's attacks at Montcornet had demonstrated French armor could still threaten German logistics. A prudent operational pause to allow infantry to consolidate gains and secure flanks aligned with traditional German military doctrine. When I cross-reference these 3 explanations with the timeline of orders and responses, what emerges isn't a single clear decision, but a confluence of factors. Hitler's desire to preserve armor, Göring's institutional ambition, and Rundstedt's operational caution, combining into a 48-hour delay that transformed Allied catastrophe into Allied escape. The numbers tell the story more precisely than memoirs written with hindsight. On the 24th of May, at 1200 hours, approximately 196,000 Allied soldiers were inside the Dunkirk perimeter. German intelligence estimated this number at roughly 150,000, an undercount that would prove significant. The perimeter at that moment measured approximately 40 kilometers from Gravelines to the Belgian border, defensible but vulnerable to determined assault. Had German armor continued its advance that afternoon, the perimeter would have been penetrated before British forces could establish continuous defensive lines. Instead, the halt order gave British commanders, specifically General Harold Alexander and Admiral Bertram Ramsay, 48 hours to organize a defensive position and begin assembling the naval vessels that would eventually evacuate over 300,000 men. The Luftwaffe's role in the halt decision reveals the gap between theoretical capability and operational reality. Göring promised Hitler that air power alone could destroy the Dunkirk pocket, citing the Luftwaffe's success at Sedan and Warsaw as proof of what concentrated bombing could achieve. The promise rested on several assumptions: that weather would remain clear for sustained operations, that the RAF would not contest Luftwaffe supremacy over Dunkirk, that bombing could achieve the same psychological effect on entrenched troops that it had achieved on troops in motion. All three assumptions proved false. Between the 26th of May and the 4th of June, the Luftwaffe flew 1,882 sorties against the Dunkirk pocket, a substantial effort, but insufficient to achieve the promised annihilation. The RAF's Fighter Command, operating from bases in southern England, flew 2,739 defensive sorties, contesting German air supremacy and preventing the Luftwaffe from achieving the unimpeded access Göring had assumed. The weather proved equally problematic. Between the 27th and 30th of May, low clouds and rain restricted Luftwaffe operations to brief windows of opportunity. Stuka dive bombers, designed for precision attacks against point targets, proved far less effective against dispersed troops on open beaches than they'd been against static bunkers at Sedan. The psychological effect that had paralyzed French defenders at the Meuse didn't translate to British soldiers, who had room to disperse, and who'd already experienced Luftwaffe attacks during the retreat. German bombing sank 6 British destroyers, damaged 19 more, and destroyed numerous smaller vessels. Tactical successes that nonetheless failed to prevent evacuation. The Luftwaffe's sortie rate and bomb tonnage would have been devastating against a static target like a city or fortress. Against a dynamic target like an evacuation operation, spread across kilometers of coastline with hundreds of individual vessels constantly moving, air power alone proved insufficient. The Halt order's strategic implications became clear only gradually. On the 26th of May, at 18:30 hours, Hitler lifted the restriction, authorizing resumed ground operations. But 48 hours had elapsed, and in that time, British forces had established defensive positions with 7 divisions manning a continuous perimeter. German panzer divisions that might have broken through scattered resistance on the 24th faced prepared defenses on the 26th. The attack resumed, but now it was an assault on fortified positions rather than a pursuit of retreating forces. The changed tactical situation required different methods: infantry attacks supported by artillery rather than armored breakthrough, and consumed time the British used to continue loading soldiers onto ships. Each hour of fighting allowed approximately 2,955 additional Allied soldiers to board vessels for England, a rate calculated from British Admiralty records showing 338,226 evacuated over 9 days. What fascinates me about the Halt order is how clearly the archive documents Hitler's post-decision uncertainty. German military records from the 25th through 27th of May show him repeatedly questioning whether the Luftwaffe could achieve what Göring promised, receiving optimistic reports that didn't match the reality his ground commanders were reporting. On the 26th, he authorized resumed ground operations, but maintained the Luftwaffe's priority for claiming credit. The decision structure reveals a leader torn between operational prudence, inter-service politics, and a nascent distrust of his army commanders. The Halt order wasn't a single decision, but a series of incremental choices, each one extending the delay slightly, each one giving the British slightly more time to prepare defenses and evacuate troops. British intelligence intercepted German communications discussing the Halt order on the 24th of May, but initially dismissed them as deception. British commanders assumed, reasonably given the military situation, that German forces would press their advantage immediately. The intercepts seemed too convenient, too obviously self-destructive to be genuine German intentions. Only when ground reconnaissance confirmed German armor remaining stationary did British planners begin to believe the halt was real. Even Churchill, in his war cabinet meetings on the 25th and 26th, operated under the assumption that the BEF faced imminent destruction. His authorization of Operation Dynamo, the Dunkirk evacuation, was initially framed as a desperate attempt to save perhaps 45,000 men, roughly 15% of the trapped force. That the operation ultimately evacuated over 300,000 exceeded even optimistic projections, made possible by those 48 hours when German armor sat idle while British defenses solidified. To me, the most telling detail comes from Halder's diary entries during this period, which grow progressively more bitter as he watches the British strengthen positions that could have been overrun 2 days earlier. May 27th. The decision to halt was perhaps defensible on the 24th. It is indefensible on the 27th. May 29th. Each day we wait, more British escape. This victory shrinks in value. June 1st. We have won the battle and lost the strategic objective. Halder was watching victory slip away, not through German defeat, but through German restraint. And his diary preserves the frustration of a staff officer who understands the arithmetic of time and space, watching political calculations override operational logic. The Halt order illustrated how institutional rivalry between German services could degrade military effectiveness, a problem that would recur throughout the war, but that appeared at Dunkirk, with consequences Britain exploited fully. The evacuation proceeded from the 27th of May through the 4th of June. 9 days of improvised naval operations that extracted soldiers from beaches, using everything from destroyers to fishing boats. The Luftwaffe sank or damaged enough vessels to make the operation costly. 226 British ships lost or damaged, including 6 destroyers sunk, but couldn't prevent it. German ground forces reached Dunkirk's outskirts, but faced organized resistance that transformed each block into a separate tactical problem. By the time German infantry entered the city on the 4th of June, the last British soldiers were already boarding ships, leaving behind equipment and vehicles, but taking home the trained manpower that would form the nucleus of Britain's eventual return to the continent. The Halt order didn't cause Germany to lose the war. Germany would make far more catastrophic decisions in the years ahead, but it prevented Germany from winning the war in June 1940. Britain survived, and survival bought time for everything that followed. The archive preserves this moment as a confluence of decisions, each individually defensible, that collectively transformed Allied catastrophe into Allied escape. 48 hours when madness disguised as confidence, as Halder wrote, allowed over 300,000 men to reach England and continue fighting. Chapter 9. The Exodus. 6 million on the roads. The 19th of May, 1940, 0840 hours. The sub-prefecture of Abbeville, a small administrative office in the Somme department responsible for civil administration, in a region that was rapidly losing any semblance of administrative control. The sub-prefect, a career civil servant whose name appears in the archives only as Marchand, sent a telegram to the Interior Ministry in Paris that morning. His language bureaucratic, but the desperation clear even in official prose. Estimate 47,000 refugees entered district overnight. Food stocks exhausted. Roads impassable. Request instructions. The reply arrived at 15-20 hours, shorter than the request. Maintain order. No further resources available. Between those two telegrams, the plea for help and the admission that help wouldn't come, lay the outline of France's second collapse, the civilian catastrophe that unfolded, parallel to military defeat, and made that defeat irreversible. The scale of civilian displacement during the fall of France remains difficult to comprehend, even when examining the numbers. French Interior Ministry estimates, compiled from prefecture reports filed between the 10th of May and the 25th of June, suggest that somewhere between 6 million and 10 million people, roughly 16 to 25% of France's population, were on the roads during the campaign. The variance in estimates reflects the impossibility of counting a population in chaotic motion. Prefecture reports tallied refugees passing through checkpoints, crossing into new administrative districts, arriving at reception centers. But millions more never appeared in official counts, moving along secondary roads, sleeping in fields, dying in ditches without anyone recording their passage. The lower estimate, 6.5 million, comes from post-war demographic studies that compared population registers before and after the Exodus, trying to account for everyone who'd left home and where they eventually settled. Even this conservative number equals the entire population of Wisconsin, relocating simultaneously on roads designed for 1920s traffic density. When I overlay refugee movement data with military logistics planning, what becomes clear is that Plan D's failure wasn't just strategic. It was geometric. The road network from northern France to Paris and points south comprised roughly 12,000 kilometers of paved highways and another 30,000 kilometers of secondary roads. Under normal conditions, this network could handle perhaps 2 million vehicle movements per day across the entire system. The Exodus generated an estimated 4.2 million vehicle movements in the first week alone. Cars, trucks, horse carts, bicycles, all competing for limited road space with military convoys trying to move north toward combat zones. The arithmetic of road capacity created mathematical certainty. The system would fail. The only questions were when and how catastrophically. The failure manifested differently in different regions, but a representative example comes from the Amiens sector, where the prefecture maintained detailed records even as its administrative authority dissolved. On the 20th of May, refugee services in Amiens, a city with a peacetime population of 91,000, recorded 12,000 refugees arriving in 24 hours. The city's refugee reception capacity, planned during the winter of 1939 based on experiences from the Great War, accommodated 800 people. By the 21st, the count reached 23,000 refugees. By the 22nd, the counting stopped because nobody could maintain accurate records in the chaos. Prefecture public health reports from late May note typhoid outbreak in refugee centers, caused by overcrowding that made sanitation impossible. The report lists 12 confirmed cases, then adds in parentheses, estimate actual cases significantly higher, no capacity for testing. Disease, hunger, exposure. The exodus generated humanitarian catastrophes in dozens of locations simultaneously, each one overwhelming local authorities who'd planned for manageable crisis and faced instead a flood that swept away planning itself. The military consequences of civilian displacement exceeded anything French command had anticipated. Fuel depots in the Paris region, positioned to support military operations, began issuing fuel to civilian refugees on the 10th of June, a decision made by local commanders who saw desperate families and couldn't refuse basic humanity. By the 8th of June, when French tank battalions repositioned to defensive lines along the Loire, they found fuel dumps empty or critically low. The archive preserves this choice in depot logbooks, neat columns showing military fuel allocations, then irregular entries, issued 200 liters civilian emergency, issued 350 liters refugee vehicles, issued 180 liters ambulance, civilian. Each entry represented a commander choosing immediate humanitarian relief over future military capability. Each entry also represented fuel that wouldn't be available when tanks needed it, another small erosion of France's capacity to continue fighting. The roads themselves became battlefields of a different kind. Luftwaffe attacks on refugee columns began as early as the 14th of May, initially targeting roads that might carry military traffic, but increasingly striking purely civilian movements. German propaganda claimed these attacks targeted military transport concealed among civilians, a justification contradicted by RAF reconnaissance photographs from the 21st of May, showing civilian casualties on roads with no military vehicles visible within 2 kilometers. This was terror bombing, intended to spread panic and paralyze France's rear areas. It succeeded. After the first attacks, refugees learned to scatter when aircraft approached, abandoning vehicles in the middle of roads and fleeing into fields. When the aircraft passed, they returned to find their vehicles blocking traffic, unable to move them because other refugees had boxed them in. The resulting jams turned roads into parking lots that lasted hours or days, transforming what should have been 12-hour journeys into week-long ordeals. Paris experienced perhaps the most dramatic exodus. A city of 2.8 million people, France's political and cultural capital, evacuated approximately 2 million residents between the 10th and 14th of June. Prefecture records document the progression. On June 10th, estimated 100,000 departures. June 11th, 300,000. June 12th, 650,000. June 13th, 800,000. The numbers represent catastrophic system failure compressed into 96 hours. The 4 primary roads leading south from Paris, toward Orléans, Fontainebleau, Chartres, and Étampes, created traffic jams measuring over 200 kilometers in length. Vehicles moved at walking speed when they moved at all. Fuel stations ran dry by June 11th. Abandoned vehicles littered roadways, as drivers simply walked away when tanks emptied. Photographs from German forces entering Paris on the 14th show streets lined with abandoned cars, their doors open, luggage scattered on sidewalks, the physical evidence of mass departure, preserved in automotive archaeology. Medical facilities in Paris faced impossible choices. Hospitals couldn't evacuate all patients. The elderly, the critically ill, those requiring constant care couldn't survive road journeys. When German forces entered the city on the 14th of June, they found hospitals still operating, staffed by skeleton crews of doctors and nurses who'd volunteered to remain with patients who couldn't flee. German occupation reports note 4,700 non-ambulatory patients in Paris hospitals when the city fell, cared for by roughly 300 medical personnel who'd stayed behind. The archive preserves their choice in hospital logbooks, showing staff rosters. Most names marked departed June 12th, a few marked remaining with patients. Those who stayed faced unknown fate under occupation. Those who left joined the exodus, became part of the 6 million, another fragment of France's dissolution into motion. To me, the most haunting documents are the prefecture telegrams, filed by sub-prefects throughout northern France, as their districts transformed from administrative units into refugee transit zones. The telegrams maintain bureaucratic language, even as they describe administrative collapse. Abbeville, food exhausted, medical supplies exhausted, fuel exhausted, request resupply. Amiens, roads impassable, estimate 50,000 refugees in district, cannot maintain order. Beauvais, railroad station bombed, refugee camp destroyed, casualties unknown, request evacuation assistance. Each telegram received the same reply, variations on the message sent to Abbeville. Maintain order, no resources available. The Interior Ministry couldn't help, because it was itself evacuating, first to Tours, then to Bordeaux, processing requests while packing files, trying to govern a country that was coming apart faster than governance could accommodate. The exodus created feedback loops that accelerated military collapse. Refugees clogged roads, preventing military reinforcements from reaching combat zones. Delayed reinforcements meant defensive lines broke faster. Broken defensive lines sent soldiers retreating, mixing with refugee columns, adding military chaos to civilian chaos. The combined military-civilian traffic made roads impassable, forcing both soldiers and civilians onto secondary roads ill-suited for heavy traffic. Those roads became jammed, forcing movement onto dirt tracks and farm lanes that dissolved into mud under the weight of vehicles. The system didn't just fail, it generated cascading failures, each one making recovery less likely. French military planning had anticipated refugee movements and included them in calculations. What planning hadn't anticipated was that refugee movements would exceed military movements by a factor of 10, that civilians would consume military fuel, that humanitarian concerns would trump military priorities at every level of decision-making. What strikes me most is how the numbers keep returning to road capacity, the mundane engineering constraint that determines strategic outcomes. 4 primary evacuation routes from Paris, each 12 meters wide, vehicle spacing at 5-meter intervals moving at 8 kilometers per hour maximum speed in refugee conditions. The mathematics supports roughly 480,000 vehicles per 24 hours across all routes combined. Actual demand on June 12th alone exceeded 900,000 vehicles. The system was geometrically doomed the moment evacuation began at scale. France's road network, adequate for peacetime traffic, adequate for military movements, adequate for controlled evacuation, couldn't handle military movements and uncontrolled civilian panic occurring simultaneously. The exodus proved that modern war's logistics aren't just military, they're societal. When civilian systems collapse, military systems follow, no matter how well designed those military systems might be. France lost in May and June, not just because German tanks were faster, but because French roads couldn't accommodate the retreat of an entire society, while also supporting the movement of armies trying to prevent that retreat from becoming rout. The geometry of roads and the arithmetic of time, those fundamental constraints that no amount of courage or firepower could overcome, sealed France's fate as surely as any battle. Chapter 10. Weygand's Phantom Plan. The 21st of May, 1940, 1000 hours. The Supreme War Council chamber in Paris, where General Maxime Weygand, recently appointed to replace Gamelin as French commander-in-chief, presented his strategic vision for reversing the catastrophe unfolding in northern France. Weygand, 73 years old, had been recalled from Syria to save a situation that many already considered unsalvageable. His plan, outlined on large-scale maps with colored arrows showing coordinated movements, appeared strategically sound. French forces south of the German penetration would attack north toward Bapaume and Cambrai, while British and Belgian forces in the pocket attacked south, creating a pincer that would sever the German corridor and trap panzer divisions that had outrun their supply lines. On paper, the mathematics supported feasibility. Approximately 18 Allied divisions attacking 8 German divisions spread across a 127-kilometer salient. The plan made sense. It might even have worked. It simply couldn't be executed within the temporal and organizational constraints of May 1940. The coordination problem becomes visible when examining the travelogue of Major Fauvel, a French liaison officer tasked with presenting Weygand's plan to British and Belgian commands and securing their participation. Fauvel's log, preserved in French military archives, reads like a chronicle of distance defeating purpose. Departed Paris 0600 hours by car for BEFG HQ lens. Arrived 2140 hours due to refugee congestion and detours. Presented Weygand plan to General Gaulle. Gaulle requested 24 hours to consult London. Departed for Belgian Army HQ 300 hours May 22nd. Arrived 1620 hours same day. Plan now 34 hours old. King Leopold demands French guarantee of air cover before committing forces. I have no authority to guarantee anything. The word anything is circled in the original document, perhaps by Fauvel himself, perhaps by a staff officer reading the report later, trying to understand how a reasonable plan became impossible through the friction of communication. When I calculate the timeline required for coordinating 3 separate national armies across a collapsing front using 1940 communication technology, the Weygand plan's failure becomes mechanically predictable. The plan required coordination across 127 kilometers of front, involving 18 divisions from 3 different national commands, executing simultaneous attacks at a predetermined H-hour. The approval chain required 14 separate authorizations: Weygand staff to Weygand, Weygand to French government to British government to General Gaulle, Gaulle to his corps commanders, parallel communications through Belgian command structure, then reverse confirmation up each chain. Each communication leg required physical delivery via motorcycle courier over roads clogged with refugees. Average message delivery time, Paris to British GHQ at Lens, 14 hours. Weygand allocated 48 hours for complete coordination. Modern staff planning suggests minimum coordination time for an operation of this complexity, 96 hours under peacetime conditions. The British executed a limited version of the plan on the 21st of May before complete coordination was achieved, the Arras counterattack, conducted with 74 tanks from the 1st Army Tank Brigade and 2 infantry battalions. The attack achieved tactical surprise, penetrating German positions and briefly threatening communications of the 7th Panzer Division under Rommel's command. British tanks, Matilda Mark IIs with armor too thick for German 37mm anti-tank guns to penetrate, created momentary panic in German units encountering them. Rommel's war diary for the 21st notes, heavy enemy tank attack, superior armor, conventional anti-tank weapons ineffective. But the attack remained isolated, unsupported by the French thrust from the south that Weygand's plan required. French 3rd Light Mechanized Division, assigned to attack north in coordination with British forces, didn't receive movement orders until the evening of the 21st, because communications between Weygand's headquarters and the division took 18 hours to traverse congested telephone networks and damaged telegraph lines. The archive preserves the mutual recriminations that followed. French records claim British forces withdrew prematurely from Arras, failing to hold gains long enough for French reinforcements to arrive. British records note French forces failed to attack as coordinated, leaving British units exposed to German counterattacks without the southern support Weygand's plan promised. Both accounts are technically accurate because no true coordination existed. The British attacked when local commanders judged conditions favorable. French forces prepared to attack when orders finally arrived. The temporal disconnect, British action on the 21st, French preparation for action on the 22nd, meant each force operated independently while believing it was executing a coordinated plan. The result resembled coordination's shadow, forces moving in theoretically complementary directions, but never actually supporting each other because they weren't synchronized in time. By the 23rd of May, when all 3 Allied commands had theoretically agreed on execution details and set H-hour for the 26th, the tactical situation had shifted decisively. German panzer divisions had reached the coast at Abbeville, completing the encirclement and transforming Weygand's pincer attack into an attempt to break out from a pocket rather than severing a corridor. The plan's operational logic, exploiting German overextension by attacking vulnerable supply lines, evaporated when German forces consolidated their positions and established defensive fronts facing both north and south. Weygand's staff recognized this on the 24th, but couldn't communicate the changed situation to all commands before the 26th. Some units prepared to execute the original plan, others understood it had been superseded. The result was tactical confusion that prevented coordinated action, even when local commanders were willing and able to attack. General Gaulle faced the most acute decision dilemma. By the 25th of May, British intelligence indicated German forces were tightening the Dunkirk pocket, threatening complete encirclement. Weygand's plan required Gaulle to commit his reserves to a southern attack toward Arras and Cambrai. But committing reserves south meant weakening the northern perimeter, risking German breakthrough that would trap the entire BEF before evacuation became possible. Gaulle never formally refused Weygand's plan. A refusal would have shattered Allied unity and likely triggered French accusations of British betrayal. Instead, he began quietly reorienting forces toward Dunkirk while maintaining the pretense of preparing for Weygand's offensive. French liaison officers at British headquarters reported preparations for the attack. British commanders were actually preparing for evacuation. The deception wasn't malicious. It was survival instinct overriding coalition obligations. The plan died of silence, not disagreement. Weygand continued issuing orders through the 26th and 27th, directing forces to attack positions they'd already abandoned, coordinating movements that couldn't occur because the units no longer existed as cohesive formations. His staff filed reports showing forces in position when those positions were already behind German lines. The disconnect between Weygand's headquarters' understanding of the tactical situation and the reality on the ground reached almost surreal proportions. Orders arrived directing divisions to advance when those divisions were surrendering or disintegrating under German assault. The communication lag that had made coordination impossible in planning continued through execution, ensuring that even when local commanders wanted to comply with Weygand's directives, they were receiving instructions that no longer matched battlefield reality. To me, the most tragic document from this period is a message from Weygand to Gaulle, dated the 27th of May, asking why British forces hadn't begun their attack as planned. By the time the message reached Gaulle's headquarters, British forces were already evacuating from Dunkirk, thousands of soldiers boarding ships, while Weygand was still expecting them to attack south. Gaulle's response, sent the 28th, explained that tactical circumstances had forced modification of the plan, the diplomatic language of coalition warfare, masking the reality that the plan had never been executable, and that British forces had already made the choice to preserve themselves rather than sacrifice the BEF in a coordination attempt that couldn't succeed. Weygand received this response on the 29th, 2 days after it was sent, long after British evacuation had become irreversible. He was commanding ghosts, issuing orders to formations that existed on his situation maps, but not on the battlefield, coordinating a counter-offensive that had dissolved into the friction of distance, communication lag, and institutional paralysis. What fascinates me is how clearly the archive documents the coordination problem's mechanical nature. This wasn't a failure of will or courage. Soldiers at Arras fought with determination. French tank crews at Stone demonstrated tactical excellence. Belgian forces resisted despite impossible odds. The failure was systemic. 3 separate armies with 3 separate command structures, 3 different communication systems, 3 sets of national priorities, trying to execute a complex, coordinated operation using technology, motorcycles, telegrams, liaison officers traveling by car, that couldn't accommodate the tempo modern warfare required. Weygand's plan proved that NATO-style integrated command didn't exist in 1940, and that without it, coalition operations above company scale became exercises in hope rather than coordinated execution. The plan was sound. The armies were capable. The institutional framework necessary to translate strategic vision into synchronized tactical action across national boundaries simply didn't exist and couldn't be improvised in the midst of catastrophe. The Phantom Plan haunted French strategic thinking through the end of May, a perfect counterfactual that might have worked if only time, distance, and institutional friction hadn't made perfection impossible. Chapter 11. The Somme, attrition without hope. The 5th of June, 1940, 0400 hours. Operation Fall Rot, Case Red, began with a German artillery barrage across the Somme and Aisne rivers, a curtain of fire falling on French defensive positions that marked the beginning of the campaign's final phase. The bombardment differed from the Sedan pattern. No Stuka sirens, no psychological warfare, just industrial-scale artillery, employing methods refined in the Great War. German infantry crossed the Somme in assault boats, while artillery shifted to interdiction fires, isolating forward French positions from reinforcement. The 10th French Army, holding a 70-kilometer sector along the Somme, faced 104 German divisions, attacking with the same combined arms methods that had shattered French lines in May. But the 10th Army, unlike the divisions at Sedan, was prepared to fight. What followed wasn't collapse, it was attrition, brutal and consuming, achieving nothing strategically, but proving that French soldiers hadn't lost their capacity to resist. They'd lost only the institutional framework that might have made resistance meaningful. The daily strength returns from the 2nd Battalion, 48th Infantry Regiment preserved this battle's character with bureaucratic precision. Each morning, battalion clerks tallied effectives, ammunition stocks, morale assessments, the mechanical accounting that keeps armies functioning even as they die. 5th of June, 0800 hours. Effective strength, 467 men authorized 864. Ammunition, 120 rounds per rifle, 6 belts per FM, fusil mitrailleur, light machine gun. Morale, adequate. Mission, hold present position. Someone crossed out adequate and wrote stubborn. 6th of June. Effective strength, 341. Ammunition, 80 rounds per rifle, 4 belts per FM. Morale, holding. Mission, unchanged. 7th of June. Effective strength, 263. Ammunition, 60 rounds per rifle, 2 belts per FM. Morale, holding. Mission, unchanged. The numbers declined with mathematical certainty. The mission remained constant. By the 11th of June, the final entry reads, effective strength, 187. Ammunition, 40 rounds per rifle, 2 belts per FM. Morale, stubborn. Mission, hold present position. The battalion surrendered June 11th, with 34 men still capable of fighting, having held its sector for 6 days against attackers who outnumbered it 3-1. When I examine German casualty reports for the first week of Fall Rot, the numbers contradict the narrative of French collapse that dominated contemporary reporting. German forces suffered 10,252 killed between the 5th and 10th of June, a daily casualty rate higher than during the May 10th through 20th fighting. French defensive positions along the Somme, prepared over 3 weeks during the Dunkirk evacuation, proved far more formidable than the improvised lines at Sedan. Machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire, artillery pre-registered on likely approach routes, anti-tank guns positioned in depth, the 10th Army employed defensive methods that German infantry encountered at heavy cost. The difference between May and June wasn't French fighting quality, it was strategic context. In May, defensive success might have prevented breakthrough and preserved France's front. In June, defensive success merely delayed inevitable defeat, buying hours or days that couldn't change the campaign's outcome. The 5th Colonial Infantry Division's stand at Forges-les-Eaux exemplifies this feudal excellence. Rommel's 7th Panzer Division broke through French positions on the 6th of June, advancing rapidly toward the Seine. The 5th Colonial, a formation composed of French colonial troops from North Africa, found itself partially encircled, but still combat effective. Rather than withdraw, Division Commander General René Altmaier ordered counterattacks, 3 separate assaults on the 6th and 7th that temporarily halted Rommel's advance. German after-action reports note these attacks with professional respect. Enemy resistance fierce, well-coordinated, infantry supported by armor. Progress slowed, casualties moderate to heavy. The division's war diary shows similar tactical professionalism, coordinated artillery fires, combined infantry tank assaults, proper security during movement, everything French doctrine prescribed, executed by soldiers who understood their craft. The 5th Colonial ceased to exist as a cohesive force on the 9th of June, not through collapse, but through gradual destruction. Companies reduced to platoons, battalions to companies, the division to scattered groups that fought until ammunition exhausted or encirclement became complete. The artillery expenditure during Fall Rot deserves specific attention because it contradicts claims of French passivity. French gunners fired 8,750,000 rounds between the 5th and 22nd of June, more than during the entire May campaign. The increase reflects both desperation and determination. Artillery units that had conserved ammunition in May, assuming the campaign would last months, expended their stocks freely in June, knowing no future campaign remained. French 75mm guns, the famous 75 from the Great War, still in service 2 decades later, required 12,000 rounds per day per corps to maintain effective fire support. Railroad network disruption reduced ammunition delivery to roughly 4,200 rounds per day. The deficit created a death spiral. Inadequate artillery support led to higher infantry casualties. Higher casualties led to faster unit dissolution. Dissolution reduced defensive cohesion, forcing greater reliance on artillery that wasn't adequately supplied. French units fought with whatever ammunition reached them, rationing shells, prioritizing targets, making each round count because the next resupply might never arrive. The Italian declaration of war on the 10th of June, opening the Alpine front, added absurdity to France's catastrophe. Italian forces attacked with 32 divisions against 6 French Alpine divisions defending mountain fortifications. The French halted every Italian assault, inflicting casualties at ratios exceeding 10-to-1 in some sectors. French mountain troops, fighting with the advantage of prepared positions on favorable terrain, demonstrated what defensive operations could achieve when defenders possessed time to prepare and attackers lacked the combined arms sophistication Germany had demonstrated. But Alpine success meant nothing strategically. German forces were already crossing the Seine, advancing toward Paris and the Loire. France could defeat Italy completely and still lose the war, because Italy wasn't the decisive theater. The Alpine victories provided consolation, but not salvation, proof that French soldiers could still win battles in a war France had already lost. To me, the strength returns tell a more honest story than battle reports. Battalion clerks recording daily numbers weren't writing for history or propaganda. They were documenting reality for logistics and personnel planning. The progression from 467 effectives to 34 over 6 days represents roughly 69 men lost per day, a 16% daily attrition rate. Extrapolated across the entire 10th Army, this rate suggests the Army was consuming itself at a pace that would achieve complete destruction in roughly 3 weeks. German forces didn't need to break through everywhere. They needed only to maintain pressure while French units dissolved through attrition. The Somme fighting wasn't dramatic blitzkrieg. It was arithmetic, relentless and mechanical, calculating how long French divisions could sustain combat losses, plus desertions, plus command breakdowns, before ceasing to function. The answer varied by unit quality and leadership, but the average suggested most French formations would become combat ineffective within 10 to 14 days of sustained fighting. France didn't have 10 days. The strategic irrelevance of tactical resistance gnaws at me when reading these documents. French soldiers along the Somme fought as hard in June as in May, harder perhaps, because they understood they were fighting for time rather than victory. Regiment after regiment held positions until overrun, counterattacked when possible, conducted fighting withdrawals that preserved unit cohesion even in defeat. The 10th Army fought to near destruction for objectives that couldn't change the campaign's trajectory. Every day of resistance bought refugees additional hours to flee south, bought government officials time to evacuate archives, bought the military time to, what? Prepare another defensive line that would also fail? Preserve units for a counteroffensive that would never materialize? The strategic purpose of resistance became unclear, even as tactical purpose remained obvious. Soldiers fight because that's what soldiers do, because orders say fight, because abandoning comrades is unthinkable, because the alternative to fighting is surrender, and surrender means becoming prisoners. What the archive preserves is heroism wasted, not through soldier failure, but through institutional bankruptcy. The battalion that surrendered with 34 effectives, after 6 days of continuous combat, demonstrated courage and tactical skill. French propaganda would celebrate if France had won. But France lost, and in losing, transformed that battalion's sacrifice from heroism to tragedy. They held their position. It didn't matter. They inflicted casualties on attackers. It didn't matter. They maintained cohesion and discipline under conditions that would break lesser formations. None of it mattered strategically. The Somme fighting proved French soldiers could still fight, but fighting without strategic purpose is just organized dying. The strength returns document this truth in numerical form. Each day's count lower than the previous days. The decline is predictable as mathematics. The mission unchanged, even as the capability to execute it degraded towards zero. By mid-June, French units weren't defending France. They were fighting because stopping meant acknowledging that continued fighting was pointless. The Somme taught the final lesson of the campaign. Courage and competence cannot substitute for operational viability, and when institutional collapse is complete, tactical excellence becomes an epitaph rather than a solution. Chapter 12. The government flees, Bordeaux's bitter debates. The 15th of June, 1940, 21:30 hours. A conference room in Bordeaux, where the French government, having fled Paris on the 10th, abandoned Tours on the 14th, convened for what would become the Third Republic's final cabinet meeting. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud stood before ministers and military leaders to present choices that weren't really choices, decisions that had already been made by circumstances, but required formal acknowledgement. The room held 37 people, cabinet ministers, military commanders, parliamentary leaders, each one understanding they were witnessing the end of something, but uncertain what would replace it. Stenographic records preserve Reynaud's opening. Gentlemen, we face a choice between honor and survival. I am no longer certain which is which. Minister Camille Chautemps interjected before Reynaud could continue. The luxury of such philosophy belongs to those who do not govern. The stenographer noted long silence before the next speaker. That silence, preserved in brackets in an official transcript, contains more truth than all the words that followed. The debate's central question, whether to seek armistice or continue fighting from North Africa, had been building since the first week of June, when it became clear that no defensive line would hold and that France's continental position was collapsing. Reynaud favored continuing the war, relocating government and military command to French North Africa, maintaining France's alliance with Britain and its status as a belligerent power. His argument rested on precedent. The French government had relocated to Bordeaux in 1870, and again in 1914, continuing resistance even when Paris fell. Defeat in metropolitan France need not mean national surrender if French colonial territories remained under government control. Marshal Philippe Pétain, the 84-year-old hero of Verdun, who Reynaud had appointed vice premier in May, represented the opposing view with a moral clarity that made counter-argument difficult. Pétain argued that continuing war from North Africa meant abandoning metropolitan France to German occupation, while political leaders lived in safety overseas, a betrayal of the soldiers still fighting and the civilians still suffering. Better, Pétain insisted, to seek armistice that would preserve some sovereignty and allow French leaders to mitigate occupation's harshness through negotiation with Germany. When I examine the cabinet vote tallies preserved in foreign ministry archives, the narrowness of France's fate becomes almost unbearable. The June 15th vote on whether to seek armistice, 13 ministers in favor, 11 opposed, 2 abstentions. France's decision to stop fighting was made by a 2-vote margin, roughly 0.000004% of the national population. Those 2 votes represented Pierre Laval and Camille Chautemps, both arguing that continued resistance was futile, and that government's primary obligation was preserving French lives rather than maintaining military alliances. Their argument possessed cold logic. French military capacity was exhausted. German forces were advancing against minimal resistance. Britain couldn't provide meaningful support, and continuing the war meant condemning France to complete destruction rather than negotiated surrender. The counter-argument, that armistice meant abandoning Britain to fight alone, that Nazi Germany wouldn't negotiate in good faith, that resistance from North Africa might preserve France's honor even if it couldn't prevent defeat, required believing in possibilities rather than accepting certainties. In a room full of exhausted men watching their nation collapse, certainty won over possibility by 2 votes. The British offer of Franco-British Union, presented on the 16th of June, added surreal complexity to an already impossible situation. Winston Churchill, desperate to keep France in the war, proposed merging Britain and France into a single state with joint citizenship, unified government, and shared military command. The proposal, drafted overnight by British officials, envisioned a political entity that had never existed and that nobody had seriously contemplated until France's defeat made desperate measures seem reasonable. French cabinet debated the proposal for 4 hours, examining it from every angle, trying to determine if it was genuine offer or elaborate deception. The vote. 18 ministers rejected the proposal, 6 supported it. Those who rejected it argued that Franco-British union was politically impossible and strategically meaningless. Merging two governments couldn't conjure armies that didn't exist, or restore defensive lines that had already collapsed. Those who supported it saw the offer as Britain's commitment to continued alliance, and as a framework that might keep France fighting even from North Africa. The debate, preserved in meeting minutes, reads like fantasy literature. Serious men discussing hypothetical political structures, while German tanks advanced toward Bordeaux. Pétain's ultimatum on the 15th changed the debate's character. He submitted written notice that he would resign from government if armistice wasn't sought immediately, and his resignation would include a public statement explaining that political leaders had refused to end suffering when ending it remained possible. The threat wasn't subtle. Pétain's prestige meant his public opposition would shatter whatever remained of government legitimacy. Reynaud faced a choice between accepting Pétain's position or dismissing him and risking the political crisis that would follow. Reynaud chose neither. On the 16th of June, at 2200 hours, he resigned as prime minister, telling President Albert Lebrun that he could no longer maintain cabinet unity and that someone else must bear responsibility for what came next. Lebrun, exercising his constitutional authority, appointed Pétain as prime minister. Pétain's first official act, ordered at 23:30 hours, was instructing the Spanish ambassador to approach Germany regarding armistice terms. The constitutional mechanics deserve examination because they illuminate how democracies can dismantle themselves legally. The Third Republic's constitution provided that the prime minister served at the president's pleasure and that the president could appoint successors when governments fell. Reynaud's resignation created a government crisis. Lebrun's appointment of Pétain resolved it within constitutional framework. No coup occurred, no violence, no illegal seizure of power. The Third Republic ended through proper procedure, each step documented in official journals, each decision made by officials with legal authority to make those decisions. What made the process constitutionally questionable wasn't its legality, but its context. Cabinet meetings held in a city threatened by advancing enemy forces, decisions made under implicit coercion from military defeat, votes taken by officials who'd abandoned the capital and were themselves refugees. Can democratic process function legitimately when external pressure removes meaningful choice? The Third Republic's final act suggested the answer was no, but the question remained unresolved in constitutional terms. Charles de Gaulle attended the June 15th cabinet meeting as Under-Secretary of State for War, a junior position he'd held for less than 2 weeks. He spoke in favor of continuing war from North Africa, arguing that France's defeat in metropolitan territory didn't require national surrender if colonial territories remained free. His statement in the stenographic record occupies 4 lines. Pétain's response occupies 47. The disparity reflects both men's relative political weight and the room's receptivity to their messages. De Gaulle, 49 years old, recently promoted, unknown to most French citizens, possessed no political constituency beyond Reynaud's patronage. Pétain, aged 84, victor of Verdun, national hero, commanded moral authority that transcended politics. When these two men offered competing visions of France's future, the room listened to Pétain and dismissed de Gaulle. Within 48 hours, de Gaulle fled to London to continue resistance. The stenographic record preserves his final contribution to Third Republic governance as a footnote to Pétain's dominance. 4 lines that history would amplify, but that contemporary politics could barely hear. To me, the transcript's most haunting feature is how the silences lengthen. Early in the meeting, multiple speakers per minute, rapid back and forth, as ministers debate options and challenge assumptions. By 2300 hours, the stenographer notes, silence, duration approximately 2 minutes, between speakers. People had run out of arguments or energy, or both. The transcript's final pages show speakers offering variations on positions already stated, repeating themselves, searching for new ways to frame choices everyone understood. At 2350 hours, Reynaud announced his resignation. The stenographer noted, "Meeting concluded," without recording any formal adjournment or closing statement. The Third Republic's last cabinet meeting didn't end, it just stopped, collapsing into silence like the government itself, the stenographer marking the moment with administrative notation that provided closure the participants couldn't achieve. The constitutional question, was the armistice legally legitimate, would occupy French courts and political debate for decades. Arguments for legitimacy. The government followed constitutional procedure. Cabinet votes reflected majority will. President Lebrun exercised legal authority in appointing Pétain. Arguments against. 27% of deputies and senators were absent from France, imprisoned by Germans, fled to North Africa, or locations unknown, meaning the parliamentary body that implicitly endorsed the government lacked quorum. The cabinet operated under duress from military defeat, compromising free deliberation. The armistice constituted de facto surrender of sovereignty, which exceeded any government's constitutional authority. Both positions had merit. Both found support in legal scholarship. The answer depended less on constitutional text than on whether one believed democratic procedure could function legitimately when external coercion removed practical alternatives. Bordeaux suggested it couldn't. The archive preserves democracy's suicide, conducted with legal precision but without the freedom that makes democratic choice meaningful. The government fled Paris, then Tours, then prepared to flee Bordeaux. The fleeing didn't stop until there was nowhere left to flee except out of existence. The final refuge became an armistice that preserved the form of French government while surrendering the substance of French sovereignty. A choice made in Bordeaux by exhausted men who'd run out of alternatives and voted to stop running. Chapter 13. The Armistice, Compiègne's Theater of Revenge. The 22nd of June, 1940, 1400 hours. The forest of Compiègne, roughly 60 kilometers northeast of Paris, where a museum railway car sat on a section of track that hadn't seen regular use since 1918. The car, designated number 2419D in French railway records, had been preserved as a national monument, the exact location where German representatives signed the armistice ending the Great War on the 11th of November, 1918. For 22 years, the car remained in its museum building, visited by French citizens who wanted to see where Germany's defeat had been formalized. On the 21st of June, German military engineers removed the car from its building, placed it on the original foundation stone, marking the 1918 signing location, and oriented it with the same compass bearing it had held 2 decades earlier. This wasn't bureaucratic chance. It was choreographed historical revenge, executed with the precision Germany applied to military operations. William Shearer, American journalist broadcasting from Compiègne for CBS Radio, watched the ceremony unfold with the detachment his profession required, and the horror his humanity couldn't suppress. His broadcast notes, preserved in his personal papers, capture details the official German film footage deliberately omitted. They brought out the same railway car, the exact same car where Germany signed in 1918. It had been preserved in a museum. Hitler ordered it removed, placed on the exact spot, exact orientation. This isn't a treaty signing. This is a ritual murder of memory. Shearer understood what many observers missed, that Compiègne's significance wasn't diplomatic but symbolic. Hitler was erasing 1918's humiliation with geometric precision, replacing one historical moment with its exact inversion. The ceremony began at 15:15 hours, with Hitler's arrival, accompanied by Göring, von Ribbentrop, and senior military commanders. They entered the railway car, where French delegates, led by General Charles Hunziker, the same officer who'd commanded at Sedan, waited at a table positioned exactly where German delegates had sat in 1918. Hitler sat in the chair Marshal Foch had occupied when he dictated armistice terms to defeated Germany. The reversal was complete, staged with theatrical attention to spatial symbolism. Hitler read the preamble to the armistice terms, a statement that referenced 1918's dishonor and Germany's restoration of honor through military victory. Then, after spending exactly 15 minutes in the railway car, he departed, leaving military officers to conduct the actual negotiations. His performance was complete. He'd occupied the space, reversed the polarity of historical shame, and demonstrated Germany's dominance through location as much as military force. The armistice terms themselves combined military occupation with symbolic humiliation. France was divided into 2 zones, the occupied zone, comprising 357,000 square kilometers, 55% of French territory, and the unoccupied zone, comprising 246,618 square kilometers. But geographical division masked economic calculation. The occupied zone contains 67% of French industrial capacity, 73% of coal production, and most major cities including Paris. Germany wasn't just occupying territory, it was seizing France's economic heart while leaving enough residual territory for a French government to administer occupation on Germany's behalf. Article 8 imposed demilitarization requirements, limiting French forces to 100,000 men, exactly the same number the Treaty of Versailles had imposed on Germany in 1919. The numerical symmetry wasn't coincidence. It was revenge, encoded in treaty mathematics. General Hunziker's diary, written during the negotiations, reveals the French delegation's helplessness. They were permitted no amendments to German terms, no negotiation on substantive clauses, only clarification questions about implementation. When Hunziker asked about prisoner repatriation timelines, German officials responded that prisoners would remain in Germany until a general peace treaty ended the war, potentially years. When he requested modification to demilitarization requirements, arguing 100,000 men were insufficient for maintaining internal order, Germans refused discussion. The diary entries grow shorter and more terse as negotiations proceeded, Hunziker's prose reflecting the degradation from negotiation to dictation. June 21st. Germans presented terms, requested French response by 1800 hours tomorrow. Terms severe, but allow some sovereignty preservation. June 22nd. No amendments permitted. This is acceptance or rejection of German demands, not negotiation. June 22nd, 1835 hours. Signed Armistice. France has ceased to exist as independent power. The signing occurred at 1835 hours on the 22nd of June. Newsreel footage shows French delegates affixing signatures to documents, while German officers observed with expressions ranging from satisfaction to boredom, the routine paperwork that formalized defeat. Article 23 specified that ceasefire would take effect on the 25th of June at 01:35 hours, precisely 3 days after signing, allowing German forces time to occupy designated zones before fighting stopped. The delay meant French soldiers would continue dying for 3 more days in a war their government had already ended. Artillery batteries received ceasefire orders, but also instructions to respond to German fire until the specified hour. The absurdity of soldiers fighting a war that had legally concluded while awaiting the bureaucratic moment when the conclusion took effect captured the campaign's final degradation. Combat continuing from institutional momentum even after strategic purpose had expired. Hitler ordered the railway car sent to Berlin as a war trophy, where it would be displayed as evidence of Germany's triumph. He ordered the foundation stone destroyed, the stone that carried an inscription placed in 1918. Here on the 11th of November 1918, succumbed the criminal pride of the German Empire, vanquished by the free peoples it sought to enslave. German engineers pulverized the stone and scattered the fragments, erasing the text through physical violence against granite. The museum building was demolished. Every physical trace of 1918's Armistice site was eliminated except the railway car itself, which became a touring exhibit of German victory. The erasure continued until 1944, when retreating German forces destroyed the railway car rather than let it fall into Allied hands. By then, the car had served its symbolic purpose, demonstrating that Germany could unmake the past through force, that historical humiliation could be reversed through military superiority. What strikes me most about Compiègne is how location became argument. Hitler didn't need to conduct armistice negotiations in the forest. Any location would have served diplomatic purpose, but only Compiègne could serve emotional purpose. Only the exact railway car, the exact foundation stone, the exact compass orientation could achieve the historical symmetry Hitler desired. The choreography required removing a museum exhibit, transporting it to the forest, positioning it with surveying precision, then staging a ceremony that lasted minutes but communicated decades of accumulated resentment. German planning allocated more effort to Compiègne's symbolic staging than to some tactical operations during the campaign. The archive preserves this priority in orders detailing railway car transport, foundation stone measurements, camera positions for newsreel footage, even the specific chairs German and French delegates would occupy. Every element was planned, rehearsed, executed to demonstrate that Germany hadn't just defeated France militarily, but had erased the shame of 1918 through geometric precision. The armistice's practical effect was establishing a French government, soon to be based in Vichy, that would administer occupation while maintaining fiction of sovereignty. France would have a government, a capital, even a small army for internal security. But Germany controlled France's economy, its borders, its foreign policy, and could override any government decision through occupation authority. The arrangement preserved French administrative structure while subordinating it completely to German interests, a form of control more efficient than direct occupation because it allowed Germany to govern France through French officials rather than deploying German administrators. Pétain had sought armistice to preserve French sovereignty. What he achieved was sovereignty's shell, emptied of substance, maintained as administrative convenience for the occupying power. To me, the most revealing detail is the newsreel footage's editing. German propaganda films show Hitler entering the railway car, reading the preamble, then departing, projecting dominance through brevity. They show French delegates signing documents with somber expressions, demonstrating submission. What the footage omits is the 4 hours of technical discussion about implementation details, the questions about prisoner repatriation and economic arrangements, the mundane bureaucratic work that followed symbolic theater. The propaganda version preserves only the theater, because theater communicated the message. Germany had reversed history, humiliated France as France had humiliated Germany, used the same location to demonstrate that military force determined historical meaning. The fuller archive, including Hunziker's diary and Schirer's notes, shows that behind the theater lay Germany's careful planning for how to exploit France economically, while minimizing occupation costs. Compiègne was performance. The armistice terms were extraction plan. Both served German interests, but only the performance was photographed for history. The archive preserves both, letting us see past the stage symbolism to the calculated exploitation it disguised. Chapter 14. The Navy's Choice, Meuse el-Kébir. The 3rd of July, 1940, 08:54 hours. The damage control log aboard the French battleship Bretagne, anchored in the Algerian harbor of Meuse el-Kébir, recorded the morning's events with the mechanical precision that naval discipline required. British ultimatum delivered. Admiral Gensol refuses to read to crew, states, "We are French Navy, not German Navy. We will not be dictated to by former allies." 09:17 hours. British open fire. First salvo short by 200 meters. Second salvo. The log ends there, mid-sentence, the final entry cut off by the 15-inch shell that penetrated Bretagne's magazine and detonated 920 tons of cordite and armor-piercing ammunition. The explosion tore the battleship apart in approximately 4 minutes, killing 1,012 of her crew. The log was recovered in 1952 by French naval divers, its final, incomplete sentence serving as unintentional epitaph for a ship and a relationship. The Franco-British alliance that had survived Germany's assault but couldn't survive France's armistice. The British ultimatum, delivered that morning by Captain Cedric Holland to French Admiral Marcel Bruno Gensoul, offered 4 options: sail the French fleet to British ports and continue fighting alongside the Royal Navy, sail to French West Indies ports and demilitarize under British supervision, sail to United States ports for internment, or scuttle the ships within 6 hours. All options shared a common requirement: preventing the French fleet from falling under German or Italian control, ensuring that ships France had built wouldn't be used against Britain. The ultimatum rested on British assumption that Article 8 of the Compiègne Armistice, which prohibited Germany from seizing French naval vessels, represented a promise Germany wouldn't keep. British intelligence estimated Germany would eventually demand the French fleet, either directly or through puppet government pressure, and that French resistance to such demands couldn't be guaranteed under occupation conditions. When I examine the timeline of communications between Gensol and British Vice Admiral James Somerville, commanding Force H offshore, what becomes clear is how translation delays and procedural friction transformed potential compromise into catastrophe. At 0930 hours, Gensol rejected the British ultimatum. informing Somerville that French ships would sail only if attacked, and that he was preparing his squadron to sortie, either to engage British forces or to escape to another port. Somerville couldn't determine which. At 17:20 hours, 10 hours into the crisis, Gensoul proposed a compromise: sail the fleet to French Morocco and demilitarize there, beyond German reach but under French control. This proposal reached Somerville's flagship at 17:54 hours, a 34-minute delay while the message was translated from French to English and delivered to the admiral's cabin. Somerville found the proposal potentially acceptable and requested permission from the Admiralty to negotiate further. But by the time his request could reach London and receive response, circumstances had changed. British aerial reconnaissance reported at 17:40 hours that the French battleship Strasbourg had raised steam and appeared to be preparing to sortie. Somerville interpreted this as imminent breakout attempt. If Strasbourg escaped to Toulon, the negotiations would fail, and French heavy ships would remain in Mediterranean under conditions Britain couldn't control. He faced a decision: wait for Admiralty guidance on Gensoul's compromise proposal, allowing Strasbourg time to escape, or execute the attack orders he'd been given, and prevent any French ships from leaving. At 17:50 hours, Somerville ordered Force H to open fire. 4 minutes later, Gensoul's compromise proposal arrived on his flagship. The margin between compromise and catastrophe measured 4 minutes, the time required for a message to travel from communications office to admiral's cabin, a delay that meant firing orders were already issued when diplomatic opportunity appeared. The bombardment lasted 10 minutes, 1750 to 1800 hours, during which British battleships Hood, Valiant, and Resolution fired at ranges of 17,500 meters against French ships at anchor. The gunnery was precise. British crews had trained for years on surface combat, and stationary targets presented minimal difficulty. Bretagne exploded after receiving multiple hits in her first 3 minutes under fire. Dunkirk took 4 direct hits that wrecked her forward turrets and ignited fires throughout the ship, forcing her to beach herself in shallow water to prevent sinking. Provence grounded herself after taking a single hit that damaged her propulsion. Only Strasbourg escaped, building speed during the bombardment and fleeing east toward Toulon with several destroyers in company. British aircraft pursued, but achieved only minor damage. The battleship that Somerville had tried to prevent escaping was the only French heavy ship to survive intact, while the ships that had remained at anchor, the ones not attempting to flee, bore the full weight of British firepower. French casualties totaled 1,297 dead, roughly 5% of the fleet personnel at Mers el-Kabir, killed in 10 minutes of fratricide. British casualties, 0. The disparity reflects the tactical reality of shore bombardment against anchored ships, targets that can't maneuver, that present predictable aim points, that possess minimal ability to return effective fire against enemies at extreme range. French battleships carried 40mm anti-aircraft guns and 15-inch main batteries, neither of which could effectively engage British ships positioned at 17,000-meter range. The engagement wasn't combat, it was execution, methodical and one-sided, conducted with professional efficiency that made the moral horror more acute rather than less. British gun crews performed their duties with the competence their training demanded. French damage control parties fought fires and attempted to save ships with the courage their oaths required. Neither side possessed the authority to prevent what both suffered, a battle between allies who'd fought together for 4 years, separated by 4 weeks of political dissolution and mutual distrust. Churchill's reaction, reported by his personal secretary, combined strategic satisfaction with personal anguish. When informed of British casualties, 0 killed, he wept. Not from relief, but from grief at what success had required. His secretary noted, he said, "This is the most hateful decision I have ever made." Then he paused and added, "It is also absolutely necessary." The contradiction captured Britain's strategic position in July 1940. Every option was terrible. The question was, which terrible option best served survival? Allowing French battleships to remain under Vichy French control, risk their eventual transfer to Germany, adding 4 capital ships to a German navy that was already planning Atlantic operations against British convoys. Attacking French ships killed Allied sailors and permanently alienated Vichy France, but ensured French battleships couldn't threaten British shipping. Churchill chose betrayal over risk, friendship over uncertainty, accepting moral burden to eliminate strategic threat. The French response combined outrage with military impotence. Petain's government broke diplomatic relations with Britain, authorized French submarines and bombers to attack British ships, and vowed revenge for what Vichy propaganda termed British treachery at Mers el-Kébir. But French military capability to retaliate was minimal. The Armée de l'Air flew several bombing missions against Gibraltar, achieving no significant damage. French submarines attempted attacks on British shipping, sinking one steamer and missing several warships. The retaliation was more symbolic than strategic, demonstrating Vichy willingness to resist British pressure, but not possessing the capability to inflict serious harm. Within 2 weeks, French military operations against Britain ceased, not because Vichy forgave Mers el-Kébir, but because continued operations achieved nothing except wasting resources and drawing German attention to French military activities that violated armistice restrictions. To me, the damage control log's incomplete final sentence embodies the moment's tragedy more completely than any official report. Second salvo. The dash represents the instant between observation and obliteration. The second when the sailor recording events witnessed shells arriving and didn't survive to complete the entry. Naval logs are supposed to be complete, comprehensive records of ship operations, from commissioning to decommissioning. Bretain's log ended mid-word because the ship ended mid-battle, destroyed by shells fired by allies who'd fought alongside France at Jutland 2 decades earlier. The archive preserves this truncated record as evidence of war's capacity to make allies into enemies faster than institutional loyalty can adapt. French and British sailors had trained together, shared ports, coordinated operations. 4 weeks after France left the war, they were killing each other with industrial efficiency. What fascinates me most is how clearly both sides were correct within their strategic frameworks. Gensoul was right that accepting British ultimatum meant surrendering French sovereignty over French ships, an abdication his oaths prohibited. Somerville was right that allowing French battleships to remain under Vichy control created unacceptable risk to British security. Gensoul's compromise, sail to French Morocco and demilitarize, would have satisfied French honor while addressing British concerns, but the 4-minute communication delay meant firing orders were issued before the compromise could be evaluated. The archive preserves this near miss in message logs, showing when Gensoul's proposal was sent, when it was received, when it was translated, when it reached Somerville, each timestamp documenting another minute closer to irreversibility. Had the message arrived 4 minutes earlier, Mers el-Kébir might have ended with negotiated demilitarization rather than bombardment. 4 minutes decided whether 1,500 sailors lived or died, whether France and Britain remained potential allies or permanent enemies, whether the armistice's coda was diplomacy or violence. 4 minutes, lost in translation and transmission, transformed possibility into catastrophe and closed whatever remained of Franco-British friendship with 15-inch shells and 1,000 tons of cordite. Chapter 15. Vichy, the Illusion of Sovereignty. The 10th of July, 1940, 1600 hours. The Casino of Vichy, a spa town in central France, chosen as temporary capital because its hotels could accommodate government ministries and because it sat in the unoccupied zone beyond immediate German control. The National Assembly, deputies and senators who'd reached Vichy from across occupied France, gathered to vote on a constitutional resolution that would determine whether the Third Republic would continue or be replaced by something fundamentally different. The resolution, drafted by Pierre Laval and endorsed by Marshal Pétain, proposed granting full powers to Marshal Pétain to promulgate a new constitution for the French state. The language was deliberately vague. What constitution? What powers? What state? None of this was specified. The Assembly was being asked to vote itself into irrelevance on the promise that Pétain would govern wisely and preserve French interests under occupation. 569 deputies and senators voted yes, 80 voted no, 17 abstained. Democracy didn't collapse in France. It voted itself into non-existence by 85% majority among those present. The vote record preserved in Assembly archives reveals what the voting tally obscures. Of 846 elected deputies and senators, exactly 214 were absent from the July 10th vote. 162 were in German prison camps, captured during the campaign or detained during occupation. 37 had fled to North Africa, continuing resistance from French colonial territories. 15 were locations unknown, some possibly dead, some in hiding, some lost in the chaos of exodus and occupation. The vote's legitimacy rests on whether an assembly missing 25% of its members retains authority to dissolve itself. Parliamentary procedure held that present members could vote on any matter before them. Constitutional theory questioned whether fundamental changes to government structure required fuller participation than a rump assembly could provide. The archive provides numbers but not resolution. 569 votes representing roughly 56% of total elected members. Enough for ordinary legislation, but questionable for constitutional revolution. When I examine the debate transcripts from the days preceding the vote, what strikes me is how procedural order masked coercive reality. Speakers followed parliamentary rules, addressing the chamber president, limiting remarks to allocated time, observing rhetorical courtesies. But the speeches occurred in a spa town, surrounded by German occupation, delivered by officials who'd fled Paris, addressing an assembly missing a quarter of its members. One opposition speaker, Vincent Auriol, protested that the assembly lacked quorum and that the vote was constitutionally void. His protest was noted in the record, then ignored. The chamber voted not on Auriol's procedural objection, but on the substantive resolution, and the majority supported Pétain. Parliamentary procedure provided the form of legitimacy, without addressing whether legitimacy could exist when external coercion removed meaningful alternatives. The vote itself proceeded under conditions that opposition deputies later characterized as intimidation. The gallery was packed with Pétain supporters, who applauded pro-armistice speakers and jeered opponents. 7 times during the debate, the chamber president had to suspend proceedings because gallery disruptions prevented speakers from being heard. The stenographic record notes these suspensions with clinical precision. Disruption, unable to transcribe, appears 7 times in the transcript, each notation documenting a moment when parliamentary order collapsed into shouting. This wasn't mob violence. Nobody was physically attacked. No threats were made explicitly. But the disruptions created an atmosphere where opposing the resolution required not just political courage, but willingness to endure sustained public hostility in a chamber where majority sentiment had already crystallized. The constitutional mechanics by which the Third Republic ended deserve examination because they illuminate how democratic systems can be dismantled using democratic procedures. The French Constitution of 1875 provided no explicit amendment procedure, meaning constitutional changes could theoretically be enacted by simple parliamentary vote. The resolution of July 10th didn't technically amend the Constitution. It delegated authority to Pétain to create a new constitution entirely. Whether Parliament possessed authority to delegate constitutional authority remained legally ambiguous. Proponents argued that sovereignty resided in the people, and that their elected representatives could exercise that sovereignty, including delegating it elsewhere. Opponents argued that delegating sovereignty meant surrendering it, and that no temporary assembly could permanently bind the nation to government forms it hadn't approved. Both positions found support in constitutional scholarship. Neither could be definitively proven correct because the 1875 Constitution hadn't anticipated this scenario. Pétain moved quickly to consolidate the authority he'd been granted. On July 11th, he issued Constitutional Act No. 1, abolishing the Third Republic and establishing the French state, with himself as head of state, possessing full executive and legislative authority. The act was countersigned by Laval as vice premier and published in the official journal, proper bureaucratic procedure disguising revolutionary change. Subsequent constitutional acts dismantled republican institutions. National Assembly suspended indefinitely, separation of powers eliminated, judicial independence subordinated to executive authority. Within 2 weeks, France's governmental structure had been transformed from parliamentary republic to authoritarian regime, each change documented in official journals, each one legally questionable but procedurally proper. The political blackmail that secured Pétain's majority emerged only later, when Allied investigators examined Laval's seized papers in 1945. Laval had compiled dossiers on deputies and senators, document statements they'd made during June that could be characterized as defeatist or anti-war. He threatened to release these dossiers publicly if the deputies opposed the July 10th resolution, destroying their political careers and possibly exposing them to treason charges. The threat wasn't explicit. Laval simply let it be known that he possessed damaging information and preferred not to use it. Most deputies understood the implication and voted accordingly. The archive preserves this coercion in Laval's papers. Folders labeled with deputies' names, containing transcripts of speeches and private conversations, organized for maximum leverage. Democracy died not through outright violence, but through subtler pressures, fear of exposure, desire to preserve careers, exhaustion from crisis, and the overwhelming sense that resistance was futile when defeat was complete. To me, the most damning evidence of the vote's illegitimacy comes from comparing the July 10th vote with pre-war parliamentary divisions. On major Third Republic legislation, assembly votes typically showed 40 to 60% support, depending on partisan coalitions. The July 10th vote showed 85% support among those present, a majority so overwhelming it suggested either universal conversion to Pétain's position or systematic pressure that made opposition untenable. Opposition deputies later testified they'd voted yes because they believed no meant ostracism, possible arrest, or indefinite detention. The archive can't prove these testimonies, fear is difficult to document, but the vote's statistical anomaly suggests something beyond normal parliamentary process generated such supermajority consensus. The constitutional question haunted France for decades. Was Vichy legitimate? Did the July 10th vote validly delegate authority? Or did external coercion void the vote's constitutional effect? French courts examined the question in multiple cases, reaching contradictory conclusions depending on political composition and temporal distance from events. The legal scholarship produced volumes of analysis without definitive resolution. What the archive establishes beyond dispute is that the Third Republic ended through its own procedures, that elected representatives voted to terminate the system they'd been elected to serve, and that this termination occurred under conditions where meaningful deliberation was compromised by occupation, displacement, and institutional collapse. Democracy proved fragile when terrified, capable of voting itself into non-existence when fear exceeded commitment to democratic process. The vote record preserves this fragility in numbers: 569 yes, 80 no, 214 absent. France's constitutional order died by mathematical majority. Each vote another incremental surrender of republican governance to authoritarian rule, presented as national salvation. Chapter 16. The Numbers, Counting the Catastrophe. The pages sit in the French Ministry of Defense archives, bound in cloth covers that have faded from blue to gray over 7 decades. Perte de guerre, 1939 à 1945. Losses of war, 1939 to 1945, compiled by military statisticians beginning in 1946, when enough records had been recovered to attempt comprehensive accounting. Table 4A presents the numbers without commentary. Total French military deaths, 10th of May to 25th of June 1940, 92,000 killed. Wounded, 123,000. Prisoners, 1,547,000. Below this, someone wrote in pencil, killed ratio lower than Verdun, 162,000 in 10 months, yet strategic result opposite. Why? That question, scrawled in a margin by an anonymous analyst, captures the campaign's essential paradox. France lost fewer soldiers than in many Great War battles, but suffered complete strategic collapse. The numbers suggested military defeat wasn't as catastrophic as political and institutional failure. The comparison with German casualties reveals unexpected patterns. Germany suffered 49,000 killed during the same period, a daily casualty rate of 1,065, compared to France's 2,000 per day. German losses exceeded planning estimates, particularly during the Somme fighting, when French resistance proved more determined than expected. The Wehrmacht lost 753 tanks destroyed or damaged beyond field repair, roughly 22% of armor committed to the campaign. France lost 1,749 tanks, but post-war mechanical inspections revealed that 63% of French tank losses were classified abandoned operational, tanks left behind due to fuel exhaustion, minor mechanical problems, or crew panic rather than enemy action. Only 37% of French tank losses resulted from combat damage. German tanks showed inverse pattern, 88% of losses from combat, 12% from mechanical failure or abandonment. The differential suggests French armored forces failed operationally rather than mechanically, that crews abandoned functioning equipment at rates indicating morale or command collapse rather than material inferiority. When I examine the prisoner statistics, the scale becomes almost incomprehensible. 1,547,000 French soldiers in German captivity by the end of June, roughly 31% of mobilized forces. German propaganda initially claimed 2 million prisoners, a number French records show as exaggerated by roughly 29%. But even the accurate count represented the largest single military surrender in French history, exceeding Sedan 1870 by more than 1 million men. 218,000 of these prisoners remained in German camps until 1945, 5 years of captivity, the longest imprisonment of Western Allied soldiers during the war. The International Red Cross compiled detailed records, prisoner camps, ration allocations, mail delivery, death rates. The bureaucratic precision of incarceration, documented with same thoroughness Germany applied to military operations, preserved in archives that recorded captivity as administrative routine. Air casualties tell their own story of lost battles and missed opportunities. The French Air Force lost 892 aircraft between the 10th of May and 25th of June, 560 destroyed in combat, 332 destroyed on the ground by Luftwaffe attacks. The Luftwaffe lost 1,428 aircraft during the same period, including 743 to French defensive fire. France inflicted more air casualties than it suffered, yet lost air superiority completely. The differential reveals that casualty exchange ratios mattered less than operational tempo and concentration. German aircraft that were shot down were often replaced within days from production lines running at wartime capacity. French aircraft losses couldn't be replaced at comparable rates because industry hadn't fully mobilized and because spare parts supply chains collapsed under the campaign's chaos. A favorable exchange ratio proved strategically meaningless when one side could sustain losses and the other couldn't. The refugee statistics defy precise quantification, but bracket estimates provide scale. Interior Ministry reports suggest 6 to 10 million internal refugees, 16 to 25% of France's population, displaced during May and June. Border crossing records show 500,000 refugees fled to Spain, Switzerland, or England, abandoning France entirely rather than enduring occupation. Prefecture mortality reports compiled after the exodus estimate between 40,000 and 80,000 civilian deaths attributable to bombing, strafing, disease, exposure, or indirect effects of displacement. The variance reflects incomplete records and the impossibility of determining causation when people died on roads, in fields, or in overcrowded refugee centers without medical attention. Each number represents a human story the archive can't recover, a name in a register, a notation in a prefecture telegram, a family that arrived at a border crossing, minus members who'd started the journey. Artillery expenditure provides unexpected intensity into campaign intensity. French gunners fired 14,250,000 rounds between the 10th of May and 22nd of June, substantially more than during the entire September 1939 through April 1940 period of the Phoney War. German artillery fired 10,380,000 rounds, roughly 27% less than French totals. France used more artillery ammunition, but lost the campaign, suggesting that volume of fire mattered less than accuracy, coordination, and integration with other arms. The numbers contradict narratives of French passivity. French guns fired continuously, consuming ammunition stocks at rates that outpaced supply. What failed wasn't French willingness to fight, but French ability to translate firepower into operational coherence. Artillery without air support, without coordinated infantry, without armor exploitation, achieved tactical effects without strategic significance. Tank operational readiness ratios revealed a mechanical reality behind tactical outcomes. French armor averaged 42% operational readiness, meaning on any given day, less than half of authorized tank strength was combat capable due to mechanical failures, maintenance requirements, or fuel shortages. German armor maintained 71% operational readiness through superior maintenance infrastructure and more reliable mechanical design. The 29-point gap meant France's numerical advantage in total tanks, 3,254 versus 2,867, disappeared in practice. Operational tanks, not authorized strength, determine battlefield capability. French units that should have fielded 60 tanks often deployed 25, while German units maintained fuller strength through better logistics and more robust mechanical systems. Industrial production during the campaign demonstrates France's continued capacity even during defeat. French factories produced 1,070 new aircraft and 340 new tanks between the 10th of May and 22nd of June, testimony to industrial mobilization that achieved substantial output despite military collapse. But production occurred in a void. New tanks arrived at depots to be assigned to units that no longer existed. New aircraft reached airfields already evacuated. The disconnect between industrial capability and military cohesion meant France possessed the material means to continue fighting, but lacked the institutional framework to employ those means effectively. Factories produced, logistics delivered, but the military organization that should have integrated new equipment into operations had disintegrated faster than production lines could replace losses. To me, the most revealing statistic is the one the analysts scribbled in pencil. Why? 92,000 French soldiers killed in 46 days, approximately half the death rate per day that France suffered during Verdun's 10 months. Yet Verdun strengthened French resolve, while May through June 1940 shattered it. The differential suggests casualties alone don't determine outcomes, that institutional resilience matters more than body counts, that armies can absorb horrific losses if command structures remain functional and political will remains intact. France in 1940 lost institutional resilience first, military capability second. The casualties were consequence rather than cause, evidence of defeat rather than its explanation. The numbers tell us what happened with statistical precision. They can't tell us why it happened, because why requires understanding intangibles the archive can't easily quantify. Morale, leadership quality, institutional trust, political will. The penciled question remains unanswered in the margin, a statistician's frustrated acknowledgement that sometimes the most important questions can't be resolved through numerical analysis alone. Chapter 17, The Verdict. Lessons Learned and Ignored. The 1st of January 1954. Charles de Gaulle sat in his study at Colombey-les-Deux-Églises, writing what would become the third volume of his war memoirs, Le Salut, Salvation. The passage he composed that day addressed May 1940, with the judgment, distance, and experience provided. France possessed in 1940 the means to win. We lacked only the will to use them properly. Our tanks were superior, our soldiers brave, our strategic position defensible. We lost because we believed we would lose before the first shot was fired. And belief, in war as in life, becomes self-fulfilling. Multiple library copies of the memoir show this passage underlined by different readers, suggesting generations of French officers wrestled with de Gaulle's verdict. The passage indicted not French capability, but French imagination. The institutional failure to conceive of victory as possible when doctrine suggested defeat was inevitable. The French Parliamentary Commission's report, published in 1947 after 2 years of investigation, identified 7 primary causes of defeat. The list read like an autopsy of institutional failure: inadequate military doctrine emphasizing defensive operations over mobile warfare, command structure that couldn't accommodate modern operational tempo, insufficient armor concentration and improper employment, air power subordinated to ground forces rather than employed as independent arm, political military coordination failures that prevented coherent strategy, inadequate industrial mobilization until too late, and collapse of morale when initial setbacks exceeded institutional capacity to respond. Each cause received detailed analysis, supported by testimony from 387 military officers and 154 political figures, a data sample representing 0.000012% of France's 1940 population. Yet their testimony formed official historical narrative. The Commission's work proved thorough, analytical, and politically fraught because assigning responsibility meant implicating institutions and individuals who still wielded power in post-war France. What strikes me about the Commission's findings is how they contradicted competing explanations offered by different political factions. Vichy apologists blamed the Popular Front's social reforms and moral decay of the Third Republic, arguing that civilian government had undermined military preparedness. Communists blamed capitalist appeasement and refusal to ally with Soviet Union, arguing that anti-communist ideology prevented realistic security policy. Mainstream Republicans blamed specific military failures and German superiority, avoiding deeper institutional critique. The Commission's report navigated these political minefields by acknowledging multiple contributing factors, while refusing to endorse any single explanation as sufficient. France lost for many reasons simultaneously: tactical, operational, strategic, political, moral. And simple narratives that blamed one factor while exonerating others missed the complexity actual events revealed. The report's most controversial finding, suppressed until 1962, concluded that leadership changes couldn't have altered outcomes. The Commission examined the counterfactual question: what if Gamelin had been relieved on May 16th, when Reynaud considered it, and Weygand given command 2 weeks earlier? Their analysis, based on testimony and examination of available forces, concluded that the command structure itself was broken, and changing commanders within that structure would likely have produced identical results. The finding challenged the comforting notion that France lost because specific individuals failed, forcing recognition that institutional dysfunction transcended personalities. No general could have saved France in May 1940. Because the system generals operated within prevented the kind of rapid decision-making and coordinated action modern warfare required. The Commission buried this conclusion in appendices, understanding it was too demoralizing for public consumption in the immediate post-war period. France's subsequent military evolution demonstrated selective learning. The Indochina War, beginning in 1946, saw French forces repeating some 1940 errors: static defense, underestimating enemy mobility, colonial arrogance, culminating in Dien Bien Phu's 1954 defeat. American journalist Bernard Fall, covering Indochina, noted the parallels in Street Without Joy, published 1961. French commanders in Vietnam built another Maginot Line, this time made of fortified positions rather than concrete, and discovered again that defensive mindset invites defeat when facing mobile, motivated opponents. The Indochina experience forced renewed doctrinal examination, but by then, France was withdrawing from colonial empire and reorienting toward European defense. Nuclear weapons development in the 1960s represented France's strategic response to 1940s institutional lessons. If France couldn't rely on allies, Britain had attacked at Mers el-Kebir, America had demanded French colonial concessions, then France required independent deterrence. President de Gaulle's force de frappe policy, establishing independent nuclear capability, explicitly referenced 1940s coalition failures as justification. French defense policy documents from the 1965 White Paper state, France will never again depend on alliance commitments that may be abandoned under pressure. National defense requires national means under exclusive national control. 1940s betrayals, real and perceived, generated strategic choices that shaped French defense policy for decades. Modern French military doctrine, updated continuously through the 1990s and 2000s, explicitly rejected 1940s methodical battle concepts in favor of rapid deployment, network-centric operations, and force projection. Doctrine publications from 2018 emphasize operational tempo advantage and decision cycle superiority, direct responses to the command paralysis that doomed France in 1940. When I compare 1940 French command response time, GQG order to frontline execution, averaged 18 to 36 hours, with modern French military command, order to execution targeted at 90 minutes via digital networks, the 95% reduction in decision lag represents the campaign's core lesson distilled into institutional capability. Technology alone didn't create this improvement. It required accepting that modern war occurs at tempos incompatible with methodical 19th century command procedures. The lesson France struggled most to learn involved institutional resistance to inconvenient truths. The 1940 campaign had been predicted. Corrap's October Memorandum, de Gaulle's pre-war writings on armored warfare, intelligence reports identifying Sedan vulnerability. The warnings existed. The system couldn't process them because they contradicted prevailing assumptions. This pattern recurred in Indochina, where intelligence correctly identified Viet Minh capabilities, but commanders dismissed evidence that contradicted colonial superiority assumptions. It recurred in Algeria, where political leadership refused to acknowledge military solutions couldn't resolve political problems. The archive shows France repeatedly encountering information that challenged institutional beliefs and repeatedly filing that information away rather than adapting beliefs to match evidence. To me, de Gaulle's phrase, "we believed we would lose," cuts deeper than material or tactical analysis. He identified imagination failure as the decisive factor, the inability to conceive of victory when doctrine suggested defeat was inevitable. French command in May 1940 operated within a conceptual framework where panzer breakthroughs weren't supposed to be possible, where Ardennes crossings violated military geography, where six-day catastrophes contradicted historical precedent. When reality violated the framework paralyzed response rather than adapting to accommodate new information. This wasn't stupidity. Gamelin, Weygand, Georges were intelligent, experienced officers. It was institutional rigidity, the calcification of thought that occurs when organizations prize doctrine over observation, when theory trumps evidence, when what should be possible matters more than what's actually happening. The 1940 defeat's lasting legacy might be institutional humility, awareness that no matter how thoroughly forces prepare, opponents may employ methods preparation didn't anticipate, and that adaptation speed matters more than planning thoroughness. Modern French military education emphasizes this through case studies that examine 1940 not as historical curiosity, but as warning. Officer candidates study Sedan, not to learn what French commanders did wrong, but to recognize the symptoms of institutional paralysis, the dismissal of inconvenient intelligence, the filing of warnings that should trigger action, the continuation of plans after circumstances have invalidated them. The lesson isn't that France had inferior tanks or soldiers. The lesson is that institutional frameworks can make superior resources irrelevant if those frameworks prevent effective employment of available means. What France lost in 1940 that wasn't measurable in tanks or casualties was faith in institutional competence. The Third Republic's military and political structures had failed completely, publicly, catastrophically. Rebuilding required not just new equipment, but new institutions, different command arrangements, different civil-military relationships, different assumptions about how modern states organize for security. The Fourth Republic, established in 1946, attempted institutional reforms but retained many Third Republic weaknesses, contributing to its own collapse in 1958. The Fifth Republic, de Gaulle's creation, incorporated 1940's lessons into constitutional structure, stronger executive authority, reduced parliamentary power, decision-making centralized to prevent the paralysis that had doomed the Third Republic. Whether these changes addressed 1940's actual failures or simply concentrated authority differently remains debated. But the attempt to learn institutional lessons demonstrated that France understood defeat hadn't been primarily military. The archive's final lesson appears in documents France didn't produce, the orders never issued, the warnings never heeded, the decisions never made because the system couldn't generate them fast enough. Historians can document what happened with reasonable precision. We struggle to document what didn't happen but should have. The counterattacks never ordered, the withdrawals never authorized, the reallocations never attempted because command cycles ran slower than events. The absence of decisions, the silence in the archive where orders should exist, proves more damning than recorded failures, because it reveals institutional paralysis that made failure inevitable. France in 1940 possessed means to contest outcomes. What France lacked was the institutional velocity to employ those means before circumstances made them irrelevant. That lesson, that modern war belongs to institutions that can adapt faster than opponents can attack, remains valid as technology accelerates operational tempo, and as institutional inertia remains constant across decades. The Wehrmacht understood this in 1940. France learned it through defeat. The question the archive can't answer is whether institutional learning persists across generations, or whether each generation must relearn the cost of rigidity through its own catastrophe.